In the humid swamplands of southern Louisiana, specifically in a small, unmapped garage just off Interstate 10, there was a man who understood something about internal combustion that the entire engineering department of the National Hot Rod Association had completely missed. It was 1984. The sport of drag racing was shifting from a wild, unregulated frontier into a corporate-sponsored billboard era, and the rulebook was becoming thicker than a Bible. But this mechanic, let's just call him Doc because that's what the locals called anyone who could fix a big block Chevy with a stethoscope and a screwdriver, didn't care about the corporate shift. He cared about one thing: the specific energy density of methanol when it interacted with humidity. Doc knew that in the suffocating heat of a Louisiana summer, engines choked. The air was too thick with water vapor, the oxygen density dropped, and horsepower vanished. Every racer in the division fought the same battle. They tuned their carburetors, they advanced their timing, and they prayed for a cool breeze that never came. But Doc didn't pray. He did chemistry. He realized that if he couldn't change the air going into the engine, he had to change the fuel waiting in the tank. And what he cooked up in that Bayou garage wasn't just an additive. It was a chemical weapon that would spark a 5-year cat-and-mouse game with the most powerful sanctioning body in motorsports. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the gray areas of racing history where the rulebook ends and the cheating begins. If you're someone who loves stories about mechanical ingenuity, forbidden chemistry, and the little guys who outsmart the billion-dollar teams, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing about cheating in racing. It's rarely about breaking a rule that explicitly exists. It's usually about finding a gap where a rule should be but isn't. In 1984, the NHRA rules regarding fuel in the sportsman classes were surprisingly simple. If you were running a gas class, you ran gasoline. If you were running an alcohol class, you ran methanol. The enforcement mechanism for this was a tool called a hydrometer. It's a simple glass tube that floats in a sample of liquid. Depending on how high or low it floats, it tells you the specific gravity, basically the density of the fuel. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds foolproof. If you add something to the fuel, the density changes, the float moves, and you get caught. And for 99% of the racers trying to sneak a little nitro into their tanks, that's exactly what happened. Nitro-methane is heavy. You pour it into gasoline or methanol, and the specific gravity shoots up. The hydrometer sinks. You go home disqualified. But Doc wasn't interested in nitromethane. He was interested in a class of chemicals known as epoxides, specifically a nasty, volatile, cancer-causing liquid called propylene oxide. Propylene oxide is terrifying stuff. It's used industrially to make polyurethane plastics, but in an engine, it acts as an oxygenate. It carries its own oxygen atoms into the combustion chamber. When it burns fast and hot, effectively increasing the octane rating and the flame speed of the mixture. But here is the genius part, the part that Doc figured out while sweating through his shirt in that Louisiana garage. Propylene oxide has a specific gravity of roughly 0.83. Pure methanol is about 0.79. They are close, very close. If you just dumped a gallon of propylene oxide into your fuel cell, the hydrometer would catch it. The density would shift just enough to look suspicious. But Doc realized that the density of fuel changes with temperature. Cold fuel is denser, hot fuel is lighter. In the blistering heat of a Louisiana track day, the fuel in everyone's tank was expanding, becoming less dense. Doc found that if he mixed a precise 8% ratio of propylene oxide with his methanol, the mixture should have been too heavy. But if he kept that fuel mixture chilled in an ice chest until the very last second before the run, and then accounted for the 95-degree ambient temperature expanding the liquid in the tank, the specific gravity would settle right into the legal range on the inspector's hydrometer for the 10 minutes that mattered. He wasn't just cheating the chemistry, he was cheating the physics of thermal expansion. The first time he tested it was at a divisional meet near Baton Rouge. The car was a 1969 Camaro. Ragged around the edges, primer spots on the fenders, looking like every other bracket racer's weekend project. The driver, a local kid who didn't know a covalent bond from a lug nut, just knew that Doc had tuned it up. When they rolled into the staging lanes, the air was thick enough to drink. Density altitude was over 3,000 feet. Engines were wheezing all around them. The Camaro fired up, and immediately the exhaust note was different. It didn't have the lazy lope of a methanol motor struggling in the heat. It had a sharp, crackling crispness to it. Here's what most people don't realize about drag racing. It's an auditory sport. You can hear horsepower, and you can definitely hear weird horsepower. The Camaro staged, the tree dropped, and the car didn't just leave, it evaporated. It cut a 60-foot time that belonged in a different class. At the 8th mile marker, it was pulling like a freight train. When it crossed the stripe, the wind light came on. But more importantly, the elapsed time was 0.2 of a second faster than the car had ever run before. In a sport where people spend $10,000 to find 0.02 of a second, 0.2 is an eternity. It's the difference between a photo finish and a massacre. Doc stood by the fence, watching the numbers flash on the board, and he didn't smile. He knew exactly what had just happened. The propylene oxide had effectively brought its own atmosphere into the cylinders, ignoring the humid Louisiana air outside. The engine was breathing sea-level air in a swamp. But then came the dreaded wave. The tech inspector at the end of the track pointed the Camaro toward the scales and the fuel check station. This was a moment of truth. The inspector, a grizzled veteran who had seen every trick from nitrous lines hidden in roll cages to lead shot in the frame rails, popped the fuel cap. He lowered his nose to the tank. He frowned. "Smells sweet," the inspector grunted. "It's the new additive package from VP," Doc lied, his voice a slow, unbothered drawl. "Supposed to help with the top-end lube." The inspector pulled a sample. He dropped the hydrometer in. Doc watched the glass float bob in the clear liquid. It settled. It held. It was right on the line, the absolute upper limit of the allowable specific gravity for methanol, but technically, legally, inside the line. The temperature calculation had worked. The inspector stared at it for a long moment, tapped the glass to make sure it wasn't sticking, and then shrugged. "Pass," he said. That single word, pass, was the spark that lit the fuse on one of the most secretive and explosive cheating scandals in the Southern Division. Because Doc didn't stop there. He went home, looked at his data, and realized that if 8% worked, he could go higher. But to go higher, he would need to defeat the hydrometer completely. He needed to find a chemical that was lighter than methanol to balance out the heavy propylene oxide, creating a neutral density blend that was chemically supercharged, but physically indistinguishable from stock fuel. He needed to build a ghost fuel. And to do that, he would have to turn his garage into a full-blown chemistry lab, sourcing chemicals that were usually restricted to industrial manufacturing plants. The Louisiana Blend was born. But what Doc didn't know was that he wasn't the only one suspicious of the sudden performance jump. The NHRA was beginning to hear rumors, and they were about to bring something to the track that a simple hydrometer couldn't fight. Look, successful cheating isn't about being invisible. It's about being boring. Doc understood this better than anyone. If you show up to the track with a car that looks like a spaceship and runs a second faster than the national record, they will tear your engine apart bolt by bolt. They will measure the displacement, they will CC the heads, they will check the cam lift. But if you show up with a car that looks like a beater, runs just 0.2 faster than it should, and you pass the initial inspection with shrug, you become a legend. By the spring of 1985, Doc wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was a phantom chemist. The initial success with the 8% mixture had emboldened him. He realized that the specific gravity test, the hydrometer, was a binary lock that he had picked. But the problem with propylene oxide, beyond the fact that it is incredibly carcinogenic, is that it is heavy. As I mentioned, it sits at about 0.83 specific gravity. Methanol is 0.79. Every drop of pop, as the racers started calling it, he added made the fuel heavier. He hit a ceiling. He couldn't add more power without the hydrometer sinking like a stone and getting him banned for life. So he needed a counterweight. He needed a chemical that was lighter than methanol, combustible, and miscible, meaning it would mix without separating. Now, you might be thinking, why not just use gasoline? Gasoline is lighter, around 0.74, but gasoline and methanol don't like to mix without help, And more importantly, gasoline smells like gasoline. If a tech inspector opened the tank of methanol and got a whiff of Chevron Supreme, the gig would be up instantly. Doc needed something odorless, or at least something that didn't smell like a felony. He found his answer in the industrial solvents aisle: acetone. Acetone is light, with a specific gravity of roughly 0.784. It's extremely flammable, and it mixes with methanol perfectly. Doc started running the math in his notebook. If he added 15% propylene oxide, heavy, to get the massive oxygen boost, the fuel would be way too dense. But if he cut that mixture with a precise amount of acetone, light, and a splash of another solvent called toluene to stabilize the burn, he could pull the total specific gravity back down to exactly 0.795. He had created a neutral density bomb. To the hydrometer, it looked exactly like pure methanol. To the engine, it was liquid dynamite. This is where things started to get out of hand. Doc wasn't just tuning his own cars anymore. He realized there was a market gap. He started mixing 55-gallon drums of this Louisiana Blend in his shop and selling it to select racers. He didn't tell them what was in it. He just told them, don't get it on your paint, don't breathe the fumes, and don't pour it in until you're in the staging lanes. The results were statistically impossible to ignore. In the 1985 Division 4 season, a sudden cluster of racers who had previously been mid-pack fillers suddenly started dominating. We're talking about guys who had struggled to run 1050s, suddenly punching out consistent 1030s in the heat of the day. One racer, a customer of Doc's, driving a Plymouth Duster, went from qualifying 12th to winning 3 consecutive divisional events. Here's the thing about racers. They are paranoid by nature. When one guy wins, it's luck. When 5 guys from the same area start winning, it's a conspiracy. The pit started buzzing. People walked by Doc's customers' cars and sniffed the air. The exhaust didn't burn your eyes like raw methanol usually does. It had a sweet, almost candy-like aroma. It smelled expensive. Complaints started flooding the NHRA tech trailer. Check their fuel, the losing drivers demanded. They're running nitro. They're running nitrous in the tank. They're running rocket fuel. The NHRA tech directors were frustrated. They were checking the fuel. Every time a Louisiana Blend car won, they pulled a sample. They dropped the hydrometer in. It floated perfectly. They checked the color. It was clear. They did the water test, a crude method where you mix the fuel with water to see if any oil-based additives separate out. Because Doc's mixture was fully water-soluble, it passed that too. The inspectors knew they were being played, but they couldn't prove how. It was the perfect crime, hidden in plain sight inside a fuel cell. But here is what most people don't realize about the arms race in motorsports. It forces the sanctioning body to evolve. The NHRA wasn't stupid. They knew that hydrometers were 1950s technology trying to police 1980s chemistry. They started hearing whispers about propylene oxide. The rumor mill was churning. So, in late 1985, at a major event in Dallas, the NHRA tried a new tactic. They didn't have the advanced lab equipment on site yet. That stuff cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and was the size of a refrigerator. Instead, they brought in a sniffer. It was a handheld device from the mining industry designed to detect hazardous vapors. It wasn't calibrated for racing fuel. It was designed to keep coal miners from blowing up. Doc was at that event. He saw the tech officials walking down the staging lanes with this strange, beeping yellow box. Most mechanics would have panicked. They would have drained their tanks, poured in legal methanol, and accepted the loss. But Doc, he did something brazen. He walked right up to the tech director, holding a red rag, and asked, "What's the Geiger counter for? We worried about radiation now?" The director, tired and sweating, looked at him and said, "It detects organic vapors. Anything that ain't methanol is going to set this thing off." Doc nodded, went back to his car, and told his driver, "Pop the hood." Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Doc knew the sniffer picked up vapors. So, he grabbed a bottle of Top Lube, a legal scented lubricant additive that everyone used to keep the alcohol from drying out the cylinder walls. He poured an ungodly amount of it into the fuel cell vent tube. He literally soaked the breather filter in it. This legal lube smelled like grape and was thick, oily stuff. When the tech official walked by the car with a sniffer, the machine went haywire. It started screaming. The official looked at the car, then looked at the vent tube dripping with purple oil. "It's just the lube, Chief," Doc said, holding up the legal bottle. "I didn't want the fuel pump to seize up in this heat." The official looked at the machine, which was unable to distinguish between the legal lube vapors and the illegal oxide vapors because the sensor was overwhelmed. He shut the machine off, annoyed. "Clean that mess up," he barked, and walked to the next car. Doc had effectively jammed the radar. The car went on to win the class. But that victory was the beginning of the end for the Wild West era. That moment in Dallas proved to the NHRA that field tests were useless. They couldn't rely on gadgets or gravity. If they wanted to catch the Louisiana Blend, they needed to see the molecules. They needed to stop looking at the fuel's properties and start looking at its fingerprint. The order came down from NHRA headquarters in California. Find the budget for a portable gas chromatograph. Doc didn't know what a gas chromatograph was yet, but he was about to find out. And the chemicals he was using, specifically the propylene oxide, had a molecular signature so distinct that once the NHRA figured out how to look for it, it would shine like a neon sign in the dark. The trap was being built, but Doc, confident in his undefeated season, was already working on version 3.0 of the blend. He wasn't just going to beat the hydrometer anymore. He was planning to beat the lab itself. By the winter of 1986, the landscape of sportsman's drag racing had shifted from a physical battleground to a digital one, though nobody in the pits realized it yet. While Doc was busy refining his specific gravity cocktails in Louisiana, the NHRA was busy writing checks to Hewlett-Packard. They weren't buying more hydrometers, they were buying the first generation of portable gas chromatographs. Now, unless you have a degree in chemical engineering, gas chromatograph probably sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. But to understand why this was the nuclear option for the sanctioning body, you have to understand what it actually does. A hydrometer asks, how heavy is this fluid? A sniffer asks, is this fluid evaporating? But a gas chromatograph asks, what exactly is this fluid made of, molecule by molecule? Here is the best way to visualize it. Imagine you have a fruit smoothie. A hydrometer can tell you the smoothie weighs 1 pound. It can't tell you if it's strawberry, banana, or hemlock. A gas chromatograph, however, takes that smoothie, vaporizes it into a gas, and pushes it through a microscopic tube, called a column, that is coated with a special polymer. Different molecules travel through this tube at different speeds. The strawberries might race through in 2 seconds, the bananas in 5, and the hemlock in 10. By measuring exactly when each part of the gas exits the tube, the machine creates a graph. A peak appears at the 2-second mark, another at 5, another at 10. If the NHRA has a map that says methanol comes out at 3 seconds, and your fuel sample has a massive spike at 3 seconds and nothing else, you are legal. But if your sample has a spike at 3 seconds, methanol, and a smaller, suspicious spike at 4.2 seconds, you are caught. That little extra spike is the signature of your additive. It is a fingerprint that you cannot erase. The first time this machine appeared at a divisional event in Texas, it was a bloodbath. They didn't announce it. They set it up in a restricted tent near the fuel check station. They called it the lab, but really it was just 2 guys in polo shirts staring at a computer screen that was printing out jagged lines on dot matrix paper. Doc wasn't at this race, but his phone started ringing late Saturday night. It was one of his best customers, a guy who ran a super comp dragster. "They got Miller," the driver whispered, sounding like he was calling from a payphone in a war zone. "They got Stevens too. Disqualified. Banned for a year. They have a machine, Doc. It sees everything." Doc asked for details. He wanted to know what the graph looked like. He wanted to know what questions they asked. He realized immediately that his neutral density trick, the delicate balance of heavy propylene oxide and light acetone, was now his death sentence. To a gas chromatograph, density is irrelevant. The machine would simply separate the mixture into its components. It would show a huge peak for methanol, a medium peak for acetone, and a distinct peak for propylene oxide. It wouldn't just show that he was cheating, it would show the exact recipe he was using. The Louisiana Blend was dead. But here is where it gets really interesting. Most cheaters would quit here. The risk was no longer just a disqualified run, it was a reputation-destroying ban. But Doc was addicted to the problem-solving. He obtained a copy of the graph from one of the disqualified racers, a crumpled piece of paper retrieved from a trash can. He studied it for days. He noticed something critical about the NHRA's early testing protocol. The machine was calibrated to look for specific, known cheater chemicals: nitro-methane, propylene oxide, hydrazine. These chemicals had known retention times. The machine knew exactly when to look for them. If a chemical appeared at a time the machine wasn't looking for, it often just registered as background noise or hydrocarbon contamination, which could be explained away as dirty fuel lines or residue from a fuel jug. The flaw in the NHRA's strategy was that they were looking for specific needles in the haystack. Doc realized he just needed to build a needle made of hay. He needed an oxygenant that was chemically similar enough to methanol that it would hide inside the methanol peak on the graph, or appear so close to it that the operator couldn't distinguish the two. He needed a chemical cousin. He found it in a textbook from the 1940s, 1,4-dioxane. Dioxane is an ether. It's miscible in water and alcohol. It's flammable. And crucially, its boiling point and molecular behavior were somewhat distinct, but Doc theorized that if he mixed it with another alcohol, like ethanol or isopropanol, he could blur the lines. He wasn't trying to make the additive invisible, he was trying to make the peak on the graph look like a shoulder. Imagine the graph shows a sharp mountain for methanol. If you add a chemical that exits the tube just a fraction of a second later, it doesn't create a separate mountain, it just makes the methanol mountain look a little whiter, a little fatter on the right side. Doc mixed a new batch. He called it Blend X. It was far more complex than the propylene oxide mix. It used dioxane for the oxygen kick, but he masked it with a high volume of ethanol. The idea was to overwhelm the sensor with legal alcohols so that the illegal ether would get lost in the data wash. He sent a sample to a commercial lab in Houston first, under a fake company name, asking for a purity analysis. The report came back: 90% methanol, 5% ethanol, 5% unidentified organic ethers. Unidentified, that was the word he was looking for. If a commercial lab couldn't name it, the tech inspector in a tent in Oklahoma definitely couldn't. Doc returned to the track in late 1986 with a new customer, a Corvette Roadster running in super gas. The car was fast, not suspiciously fast like the propylene oxide cars, but efficiently fast. It was consistent. It printed time slips. They won the first round, then the second. At the field check, the inspector took the sample. He walked it over to the tent. He injected it into the gas chromatograph. Doc stood outside, watching the inspector's face through the mesh window. The printer started screeching. The graph came out. The inspector frowned. He looked at the graph. He looked at his reference sheet. The peak for methanol was there, but it looked chubby. It was wide. There was a weird tail on the end of it. The machine didn't flag any banned substances because dioxane wasn't in its library of banned peaks. It just saw a lot of alcohol. The inspector came out holding the paper. "Your fuel is dirty," he said, accusingly. "You got a lot of ethanol in here. Some other junk?" "I buy the cheap stuff," Doc said, shrugging. "My fuel supplier cuts it with ethanol sometimes. Is that illegal?" Ethanol was legal. It wasn't preferred because it made less power than methanol usually, but it wasn't banned. The inspector hesitated. He knew something was off. The graph looked ugly, but he couldn't point to a specific spike and say, "That is propylene oxide." He couldn't point to a spike and say, "That is nitro." He just saw a messy, wide blob of alcohol readings. He couldn't disqualify a man for having a messy fuel. "Clean your tank out before the next race," the inspector warned. "Pass." Doc walked away with his heart hammering in his throat. He had beaten the machine. He had found the blind spot in the digital eye. He wasn't hiding the chemicals anymore. He was camouflaging them. He was using the machine's own limitations against it. But this victory was dangerous. It made him arrogant. And while Doc was playing chemist in Louisiana, the NHRA was about to receive a tip from a source they never expected. A source that would expose the masking technique and force Doc into his final, most desperate innovation. The tip didn't come from a rival mechanic. It didn't come from a disgruntled driver who lost a race. It came from the most unlikely place imaginable, a fertilizer salesman in rural Arkansas. See, to make Blend X work at scale, Doc needed large quantities of industrial solvents, specifically the dioxane and the high-grade ethanol he was using as a masking agent. He was buying these chemicals through a shell company he had set up, ostensibly for agricultural equipment cleaning. But in late 1987, a salesman noticed that this small cleaning company in Louisiana was ordering chemical volumes that rivaled large manufacturing plants. The salesman mentioned it to his brother-in-law, who just happened to be a regional tech director for the NHRA. "I don't know what they're cleaning," the salesman said over a beer, "but they're buying enough solvent to strip the paint off a battleship." The brother-in-law's ears perked up. He ran the name of the company. It traced back to a P.O. box in the same town where a certain Doc had his garage. The NHRA realized they weren't dealing with a few guys mixing fuel in a bathtub anymore. They were dealing with a supply chain. This triggered a massive internal shift at the sanctioning body. They stopped looking for the magic bullet chemical and started looking at the purity of the fuel itself. They realized that if they couldn't identify the specific cheating agent because it was hidden inside the alcohol peak, they simply had to tighten the definition of methanol. For the 1988 season, the rulebook changed. It no longer just listed banned substances. It now stated that fuel must be commercial-grade A methanol. And critically, it added a purity standard. Fuel samples must contain no less than 99.5% methanol by volume, with no detectable additives other than approved top lubes. This was a sledgehammer. It didn't matter if the additive was dioxane, ethanol, or unicorn tears. If the gas chromatograph showed any deviation from a pure, sharp methanol peak, if that mountain looked even slightly chubby or had a shoulder, it was an automatic disqualification. The masking strategy was illegal by default because the mask itself, the ethanol, was now a violation of the purity standard. Doc read the new rulebook and felt a cold knot in his stomach. His dirty fuel excuse wouldn't work anymore. If his fuel wasn't 99.5% pure methanol, he was out. He had to find a way to add energy to the fuel without adding volume to the fuel. He needed something potent enough that he could use it in microscopic amounts, parts per million rather than percentages, so that it wouldn't show up as a distinct peak on the graph at 1988-era chromatographs. The machine sensitivity wasn't high enough to see it. It just looked like background noise, a tiny blip on the baseline that the operator would ignore as static. But even at 0.1%, Compound Z had a catalytic effect on combustion. It didn't just add oxygen, it destabilized the methanol molecules, making them break down faster and burn more violently. It was like adding a caffeine shot to the fuel. It wasn't the 10% horsepower gain of the propylene oxide days. It was maybe 2 or 3%. But in a class decided by inches, 3% is everything. Doc mixed the test batch. He gave it to his most trusted driver, a guy running a dragster in top alcohol. This is it, the invisible hand. They went to the Gator Nationals in Florida, a huge event. The dragster ran flawlessly. It wasn't setting world records, but it was winning rounds. It was consistent. It was fast. At the field check, the inspector ran the sample. The chromatograph spit out the graph. A single, sharp, beautiful peak for methanol. No shoulders, no wide base, no secondary spikes. The purity looked to be 99.9%. "Cleanest fuel I've seen all day," the inspector said, handing the sample bottle back. Doc had done it. He had found the ghost particle. For the entire 1988 season, his cars ran Compound Z. They won championships, they set divisional records, and nobody had a clue. The NHRA thought they had won the war because the obvious cheating had stopped. They patted themselves on the back, thinking the new purity rules had scared everyone straight. But victory makes you careless, and chemistry is unforgiving. The problem with Compound Z was its instability. It was a nitrate. Nitrates degrade over time, especially when exposed to UV light or heat. Doc always mixed the fuel fresh, right before the race, but one of his customers, a guy who bought a 5-gallon jug of the special sauce for a race in Memphis, didn't use it all. He left the jug sitting in the back of his trailer in the sweltering heat for 3 weeks. He showed up to the next race in Tulsa and poured the old fuel into his tank. He didn't tell Doc, he just assumed it was still good. He made a run. The car was fast. He won the round. He went to fuel check. The inspector drew the sample, but this time the sample wasn't clear. It had a faint yellowish tint. The heat had caused a compound Z to break down, and as it degraded, it released nitrogen dioxide, a reddish-brown gas that dissolved into the liquid. "Why is your fuel yellow?" the inspector asked. Maybe the jug was dirty," the driver stammered. The inspector put it in the chromatograph, but he didn't just run the standard test. Because of the color, he ran a slow scan, a deeper, more sensitive analysis designed to identify contaminants. The machine hummed. The graph started printing. There was the methanol peak, but this time, way down the line, in the section usually reserved for heavy oils, there was a new mountain, a jagged, ugly, chaotic spike caused by the degraded nitrate byproducts. He stared at it. He had never seen that chemical signature before. It didn't match propylene oxide. It didn't match dioxane. It looked like fertilizer bomb residue. He called the head of the department. They impounded the fuel. They impounded the car. They sent the sample to a university lab for mass spectrometry, the big guns. When the results came back 2 weeks later, the NHRA didn't just ban the driver. They panicked. The report identified nitrates consistent with high explosives. They thought they were dealing with a domestic terrorism issue, not a fuel cheat. The FBI was briefly notified. Doc heard about the bust before the feds got involved. He realized the game had escalated from sporting violation to national security interest. He cleaned out his garage that night. Every drum, every notebook, every crystal of Compound Z went into a burn pit in the deep bayou. He scrubbed the floor with bleach. He dismantled his mixing equipment and scattered the pieces in 3 different parishes. When the NHRA investigators finally traced the yellow fuel back to the driver cracked. He gave them Doc's name. But when they arrived at the garage in Louisiana, they found nothing. Just a clean shop, a 1969 Camaro on jack stands, and a mechanic tuning a carburetor. "I just fix cars," Doc told them, wiping grease from his hands. "I don't know nothing about chemistry." They couldn't prove anything. The physical evidence was gone. But the message was received. The era of the Louisiana Blend was over. The NHRA implemented new testing protocols specifically for nitrates, and the loophole closed forever. But here's the thing about legends. They don't just disappear, they mutate. Doc stopped mixing fuel, but he didn't stop thinking. And as he watched the NHRA inspectors high-fiving each other for cleaning up the sport, he noticed something else. While they were all staring at the fuel tanks, obsessing over chemistry, nobody was looking at the air intake. Nobody was looking at the oxygen before it hit the fuel. And that gave him one final, brilliant idea. An idea that didn't involve fuel at all. An idea that will lead to the single most controversial run in the history of the division. While the NHRA inspectors were high-fiving each other over their gas chromatographs and purity standards, Doc was sitting on his porch, drinking sweet tea and staring at a bicycle tire pump. He realized he had been fighting the wrong battle. He had been obsessed with the liquid in the tank, trying to chemically densify the fuel. But an internal combustion engine is, fundamentally, just an air pump. Fuel is secondary, it's just the catalyst. The real limit to horsepower in a naturally aspirated engine isn't the fuel, it's the oxygen. If you can shove more oxygen into the cylinder, you can burn more fuel and you make more power. The inspectors were looking down at the fuel lines. Doc decided to look up at the intake. He spent the winter of 1989 working on the Camaro's chassis. He told everyone he was stiffening the frame to handle the launch torque. He welded in a new crossmember, he reinforced the roll cage, but what he was actually doing was turning the car's structural tubing into a high-pressure storage vessel. He drilled tiny, microscopic holes into the base of the carburetor mounting studs. He ran hidden lines through the intake manifold casting itself, lines so well hidden you would have to X-ray the manifold to find them. These lines connected to the hollow tubing of the roll cage, and inside that roll cage, pressurized to 900 psi, was not air, but pure nitrous oxide. Here's the thing about nitrous oxide. It's not a fuel, it's an oxidizer. It brings its own atmosphere to the party. Usually, you need a big blue bottle, braided lines, and solenoids, all things that get you disqualified immediately in a naturally aspirated class. But Doc didn't use a bottle. The car was the bottle. He installed a tiny manual valve under the driver's seat, disguised as a seat adjustment lever. When the driver pulled the lever, it cracked the valve, bleeding the pressurized gas from the roll cage into the intake manifold right under the carburetor. It wasn't a massive 200 horsepower shot like the Pro mods use. It was a subtle, steady stream, maybe 40 or 50 horsepower, just enough to crush the competition without breaking parts. The system was genius because it bypassed the fuel check entirely. The gas chromatograph analyzes liquid fuel. It doesn't analyze the air the engine is breathing. Doc brought the car to the Division 4 season opener in 1989. The atmosphere in the pits was tense. Everyone knew the NHRA was cracking down. Drivers were walking on eggshells. When Doc's Camaro rolled into the staging lanes, the tech inspectors descended on it like vultures. They took a fuel sample before the run. "Run it," the inspector said, holding the vial. "It tests clean." It was legal methanol, 99.9% pure. The driver staged the car. The tree dropped. He pulled the seat adjustment lever. The Camaro launched with a violence that made the crowd gasp. It carried the front wheels past a 60-foot mark. It screamed down the track, the engine note possessing that distinct, angry, hard-edge wail that only comes from nitrous oxide. It crossed the finish line 3 car lengths ahead of the runner-up. The scoreboard lit up, a number that was 0.2 faster than the class index. It was a breakout performance that shouldn't have been physically possible on a humid day with a legal engine. The tower red-lighted him for breaking out, but the message was sent. The car was a rocket ship. The tech director was furious. He ordered the car to the barn immediately. "Tear it down," he commanded. They spent 3 hours dissecting that Camaro. They drained the fuel. Clean. They removed the carburetor and measured the venturis. Legal. They took off the cylinder heads to check the displacement. Legal. They checked the cam lift. Legal. They even cut open the fuel filter to see if he was hiding a pill in there. Nothing. They stood around the disassembled carcass of the car, covered in grease, baffled. The tech director kicked the tire in frustration. "I know he's cheating. I just don't know how." He was standing right next to the roll cage. If he had just tapped it with a wrench, he might have heard the distinct ping of high-pressure tubing. If he had opened the valve under the seat, he would have heard the hiss of the escaping gas. But he was looking for complex chemistry, not simple plumbing. Doc stood in the corner of the barn, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife, watching them sweat. He knew he had won the ultimate victory. He had forced them to look at everything, and they had found nothing. They released the car. Doc loaded it onto the trailer in silence. He never raced that car again. He sold the chassis to a guy in Texas 2 weeks later, but before he did, he vented the cage and welded the valve shut, grinding it smooth so it looked like just another structural gusset. The secret died with the sale. The Louisiana Blend era was officially over, but the legend of the ghost run of 1989 is still whispered about in southern drag racing bars. Here's what most people don't realize about the history of innovation. It is almost always driven by restriction. The NHRA's crackdown didn't stop cheating. It just forced the cheaters to become better engineers. Doc wasn't a villain. He was a pioneer who forced the sport to evolve. He made the inspector smarter. He made the fuel testing better. In a weird way, he improved the sport by trying to break it. Racing will always be a friction point between the rulebook and the racer's imagination. As long as there's a trophy and a check at the finish line, there will be someone in a garage late at night looking at a rule and asking, "What does this not say?" That's the beauty of it. The car that follows every rule to the letter is usually the car that finishes second. And in the world of legacy motoring, second place is just a first loser. 300 horsepower. In the world of grocery getters and daily drivers, that's a decent engine. But in the rarefied air of top field drag racing in the early 90s, 300 horsepower was just a margin of error. It was the difference between being a legend and being a footnote. And in 1992, one man found that massive chunk of power hiding in the absolute last place anyone thought to look. He didn't find it in the fuel mixture, he didn't find it in the aerodynamics, and he definitely didn't find it in the rulebook. He found it in the teeth of a pulley. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the engineering loopholes that changed racing history. If you're someone who loves stories about mechanical geniuses outsmarting billion-dollar industries with nothing but a notebook and a lathe, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Let's rewind to the summer of 1992. The vibe in the pits of the NHRA is tense. You have to understand the context here. This was an era where the sport was hitting a physical wall. The cars were stuck. Everyone was running the same setup, the same blowers, the same fuel pumps, and they were all hitting the same ceiling. 2,200 horsepower was the magic number. It felt like the laws of physics had just put up a do not enter sign. You could throw more money at the engine, you could throw more nitro at it, but you just couldn't get the power to the ground. Now, most crew chiefs looked at this problem and saw a limitation of the engine blocks. They thought, okay, the metal just can't take anymore. But Dale Armstrong wasn't most crew chiefs. He was looking at something much simpler, something so boring that everyone else ignored it. He was looking at the rubber belt spinning the supercharger. Here's the thing about top fuel engines that is hard to wrap your head around. The supercharger, that giant air pump sitting on top of the engine, requires an insane amount of energy just to spin. We aren't talking about the AC compressor on your Honda Civic that saps maybe 5 horsepower. We are talking about a parasitic loss of 900 horsepower. That's right. Just to turn the blower fast enough to feed the engine, you're burning 900 horsepower worth of energy. That is more power than a modern Formula One car makes, just wasted just to run the air pump. And the only thing connecting that angry, violent crankshaft to that massive supercharger was a rubber belt, a reinforced, toothed rubber belt, basically an industrial timing belt on steroids. And here is where it gets really interesting. Armstrong had a hunch. He suspected that at 8,000 RPM, when that engine is screaming and the violence is shaking the fillings out of your teeth, that belt wasn't doing what it was supposed to. See, on paper, the math is simple. If the bottom pulley turns once, the top pulley turns X amount of times. It's a fixed ratio, mechanical linkage. But Armstrong knew that fixed is a relative term when you are dealing with these forces. He started doing some math that other mechanics ignored. He calculated that the belt was moving at over 150 feet per second. At that speed, the centrifugal force is trying to rip the belt off the pulley. It wants to expand, it wants to float. Now, you might be thinking, well, just tighten the belt, right? That's what everyone did. They cranked those tensioners down until they were literally snapping the snouts off the crankshafts. They were putting so much static tension on the system that the metal was failing before the car even launched. And yet, the data didn't add up. The boost numbers weren't matching the RPM. Somewhere between the crankshaft and the blower, horsepower was vanishing into thin air. Armstrong realized it was slip, not a burnout kind of slip where you see smoke. This was microslip, invisible to the naked eye. The belt was stretching, the teeth were deforming just a fraction of a millimeter, and the pulley was spinning slightly faster than the belt could keep up with. He calculated that the driven pulley was lagging behind by 10 to 12%. Think about that for a second. Imagine you are rowing a boat, and for every 10 strokes you take, one of them just misses the water completely. That is wasted energy. In Armstrong's case, that 12% slip meant that the blower was spinning slower than it should, which meant less air, which meant less fuel, which meant they were leaving 300 to 400 horsepower on the table, every single run. Most people would have looked at that and said, it is what it is, rubber stretches, physics is physics. But Armstrong had a secret weapon. It wasn't a degree from MIT, it was his resume. Before he was a racing god, he worked in industrial automation. He spent his time designing conveyor belt systems for factories. And in a factory, you can't have slip. If a conveyor belt slips in a bottling plant, the bottles smash into each other, the line jams, and the company loses millions. Precision is the currency of that world. So he remembered something from his days in the factory. He remembered looking at the pulleys they used for heavy industrial machinery. They didn't look like the pulleys on a race car. The race car pulleys were derived from automotive standards, standard 20-degree pressure angles, shallow teeth, designed for quiet operation and smooth engagement. They were polite. They were designed not to make noise. But industrial pulleys, they didn't care about noise. They cared about grip. They used a 14-degree pressure angle. The teeth were deeper, the engagement was aggressive. They were designed to lock in and never let go. Armstrong looked at the race car pulley, which was smooth and polished and aerodynamic, and then he looked at the mental image of those ugly, blocky industrial pulleys, and a light bulb went off. He realized the entire racing industry was using the wrong tool for the job. They were using a spoon to dig a trench because it felt nicer in the hand, when they should have been using a shovel. So he went to his personal machine shop. This is the part of the story I love because it's just so analog. No 3D printing, no CAD simulations running on a supercomputer. Just a guy in Louisiana late at night staring at a chunk of aluminum. He pulled out the machinery's handbook, the Bible of machining, and started looking up the specs for industrial timing belts. He didn't just copy them though. That would have been too easy and frankly too dangerous. An industrial conveyor belt moves heavy loads at consistent speeds. A top fuel dragster goes from idle to 8,000 RPM in less time than it takes you to blink. The shock loads are cataclysmic. If he just put a factory pulley on there, the teeth would probably shear off instantly. He needed a hybrid. He needed to take the geometry of the industrial world and adapt it to the violence of the racing world. He spent 3 months cutting metal, trial and error. He machined the pulley, put it on the test bench, and ran it. Prototype number 1, failure. It chewed the belt up in seconds. Prototype number 5, it held grip but created so much heat the belt melted. This is the unglamorous reality of innovation. It's not a montage of successes. It's a montage of broken parts and expensive mistakes. Armstrong estimated he spent $30,000 of his own money on this. In 1992, that's the price of a nice house in some parts of the country. He destroyed dozens of belts. He blew up engines. Yes, actual engines. Because one time, he got the grip too good. The pulley grabbed the belt so hard, without any slip to act as a safety valve, that the blower oversped, sucked in too much air, leaned out the mixture, and boom! He literally embedded shrapnel in the walls of his shop. But that explosion told him something important. It told him he was right. The power was there. The engine had blown up because it made too much power, not because it was weak. He had found the faucet, and he had accidentally ripped the handle off. Now he just needed to figure out how to control the flow. He kept refining the design. He settled on a specific profile, Prototype 23. It had a 14.5-degree pressure angle, deeper valleys for the belt teeth to sit in, and a specific radius at the bottom of the tooth to match the belt's deformation under load. It was a masterpiece of machining. When he put it on the dyno, the results were terrifying. With standard pulleys, the engine was pushing 2,180 horsepower. That was a benchmark. That was a good day. With Armstrong's new Prototype 23 pulleys bolted on, same engine, same fuel, same blower, absolutely no other changes, the needle on the dyno swung past 2,180, past 2,300, and kept climbing until it settled at a staggering 2,510 horsepower. The room went silent. You have to understand, finding 10 horsepower in racing is a cause for celebration. Finding 50 is a miracle. Finding 330 horsepower just by changing a piece of aluminum? That's suspicious. The crew actually thought the dyno was broken. They shut it down, recalibrated the sensors, checked the load cell, and ran it again. 2,510 horsepower. It wasn't a glitch. It was a revolution. The belt temperature had dropped by 40 degrees, which was the smoking gun. That heat was energy that used to be wasted as friction. Now it was being turned into raw speed. But here is where things get complicated. You can't just dump an extra 300 horsepower into a race car and expect everything to be fine. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. If you aren't ready for it, it's going to knock you flat on your back. When they took the car to the track for the first private test session, it was a disaster. The first time Kenny Bernstein hit the throttle, the car didn't launch. It just smoked the tires instantly, hazed them all the way through first gear. It was violent and uncontrollable. The clutch setup, which they had spent years perfecting for 2,200 horsepower, was completely overwhelmed. See, a top fuel clutch is basically a controlled fuse. It's designed to slip just enough to get the car moving without spinning the tires, and then lock up gradually as a car gains speed. It's a delicate dance of centrifugal weights and timer systems. Armstrong's new pulleys threw that entire dance out the window. The engine was hitting the clutch so hard and so fast that the system couldn't cope. It took them 6 full test passes just to figure out how to harness the violence. They had to add weight to the clutch fingers, change the air gap, and completely rethink their launch strategy. But once they got it to hook, oh man, it was devastating. At the 1992 NHRA Summer Nationals, they unleashed it. The car was consistently running 2 to 3/100ths of a second quicker to the half-track mark. In a sport decided by thousandths of a second, 3/100ths is an eternity. It's the difference between winning by a nose and winning by a bus length. Now imagine being in the pits that weekend. You're a competitor. You see Bernstein's car running numbers that shouldn't be possible. You know they found something. You can hear it. The engine note was different, higher pitched, crisper. It screamed in a way that the other engines didn't. So what do? You go spying. This is the part of racing I absolutely love, the espionage. Crew chiefs would casually walk by Bernstein's pit area, sipping their coffee, trying to look bored, but their eyes were scanning everything. They looked at the headers. Did they change the pipe length? No. They looked at the injector hat. Is it a new aerodynamic design? No. They looked at the tires, the wing, the wheelie bar. They looked right at the pulleys. They stared right at the source of their misery, and they saw nothing. And this was Armstrong's true genius. He wasn't just an engineer, he was a magician. He knew that if he bolted a shiny, weird-looking pulley to the front of the engine, everyone would spot it in 5 seconds. So he camouflaged it. He had the custom pulleys anodized matte black. He bead blasted the surface to hide the machining marks. From 5 feet away, they looked exactly like the standard, off-the-shelf pulleys everyone else was running. He also implemented strict protocols for his crew. The pulleys were never, ever to be taken off the car when the pit ropes were down. If they needed to change a belt or swap a pulley, the car went inside the trailer and the doors were closed. It was black off stuff. When other crew chiefs, desperate and confused, would corner Armstrong and ask, "Dale, what did you do? How are you running those numbers in this heat?" Armstrong would just shrug. He'd give them a little half-truth. He'd say, "Oh, we really dialed in the clutch management this week," or "We found a better fuel mixture that burns a little cooler." And the competitors would run off and spend thousands of dollars chasing their tails, trying to replicate a clutch setup that wasn't the answer, while the real secret was spinning right in front of their faces. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't this illegal? Doesn't the NHRA have a rule book the size of a phone book? Yes, they do. And this is where it gets really interesting. The 1992 rulebook was incredibly specific. It told you exactly what material the engine block had to be. It told you the maximum diameter of the fuel lines. It told you how big the supercharger could be. But Armstrong had read that book cover to cover, and he noticed a gaping hole. There was not a single sentence, not one word about pulley tooth profiles. The rulebook assumed a pulley was just a pulley. It regulated the drive ratio, how fast you could spin the blower, but it didn't regulate the shape of the teeth driving it. As far as the NHRA was concerned, as long as it fit under the bodywork and didn't have moving parts inside it, it was legal. Armstrong didn't break the rules. He just operated in the empty white space between the paragraphs. For 6 months, they dominated. Bernstein's team won 7 national events. They were unstoppable. It was one of the most lopsided periods in the sport's history. Other teams were getting desperate. I mean, really desperate. There's a famous story about Big Daddy Don Garlits, the godfather of drag racing. He knew Armstrong had something. He could smell it. He supposedly walked up to Armstrong one day and offered him $50,000 cash right there on the spot just to tell him what the secret was. $50,000 in 1992. That's over $100,000 today, just for information. Armstrong politely declined. Another team, John Force's crew, tried a different angle. They proposed a technology-sharing partnership. Hey, let's pool our resources, share our data, make everyone faster. Armstrong just laughed. Why would he share the goose that was laying the golden eggs? He knew the value of what he had created, and he wasn't about to give it away for a pat on the back. But secrets in racing have a shelf life. You can only hide a physical part for so long before entropy takes over. And the way the secret finally leaked out is almost comical. It wasn't corporate espionage, it wasn't a disgruntled employee selling the plans, it was a photographer. It was the U.S. Nationals in Indianapolis, the biggest race of the year. The pits are crowded, media's everywhere. A photographer for National Dragster magazine was doing a technical feature on engine bays. He was taking high-resolution, close-up shots of the engines. He happened to snap a photo of Bernstein's engine at the exact right angle, with the sunlight hitting the front of the block just so. Later, in the darkroom, or maybe looking at the slides on a light table, he zoomed in, and he saw it. The shadows on the pulley teeth looked wrong. They were too deep. The angle was too steep. It didn't look like the automotive pulleys on every other car. He showed the photo to a veteran mechanic, asking, "Hey, does this look weird to you?" The mechanic took one look and dropped his coffee. That's an industrial profile. Within 48 hours, the cat wasn't just out of the bag, it was running wild through the paddock. Every crew chief in the country was on the phone with industrial pulley manufacturers. "I need a 14-degree pressure angle. I need deep tooth engagement. Get me whatever Armstrong has." But here's where the story takes a dark turn for the copycats. See, they knew what Armstrong had done, but they didn't understand how he had done it. They rushed to the machine shops and ordered industrial pulleys. They bolted them on their cars, expecting an instant 300 horsepower. Instead, they got chaos. Some teams lost power. Others shredded belts faster than before. One team reportedly saw their belt stretch so bad after one run that it looked like a piece of old chewing gum. Why? Because they missed the details. They missed the nuance. Armstrong hadn't just copied an industrial pulley, he had optimized it. He had spent 3 months finding the perfect root radius, the exact pitch, the specific clocking of the teeth. The copycats were using off-the-shelf industrial parts that weren't designed for 8,000 horsepower explosions. They were blindly applying a solution they didn't understand. And that is a dangerous game to play when you are sitting on top of a bomb. It took the rest of the field almost a full year to catch up to where Armstrong was on day one, and that year of dominance changed the trajectory of the sport forever. But here's the thing about engineering. It's a game of whack-a-mole. You solve one problem and you immediately create 3 new ones. And this is the part of the story that really shows you the brutal reality of high-performance engine building. Once the rest of the paddock finally figured out the pulley geometry and started making reliable power again, they ran into a new wall, a much more expensive wall. See, the belt slip had actually been acting as a fuse. It was a safety buffer. When the engine spiked in torque, the belt would slip a little, relieving the stress on the internal components. It was accidental traction control for the crankshaft. But with Armstrong's industrial-style pulleys, there was zero slip. The connection was locked. It was direct drive. So now, when the engine detonated 15 gallons of nitro-methane, that shockwave had nowhere to go but straight down the connecting rods and into the crank. Suddenly, teams started snapping crankshafts like they were made of glass. Crank snouts were shearing off. Bearings were being spun. The harmonic vibrations, which used to be dampened by the slipping belt, were now traveling right through the block. This 300 horsepower gain triggered a mechanical domino effect that forced every single team to redesign their entire bottom end. They had to develop stronger alloys for the cranks. They had to redesign the oil pumps because the bearing loads were so high that the oil was literally being squeezed out of the journals. They needed higher pressure to keep the metal floating. The cost of racing skyrocketed. What started as a $2,000 pulley upgrade turned into a $100,000 engine development program for every team in the pits. And this is where the NHRA finally stepped in.
By 1993, the sanctioning body looked at the chaos and decided they had to act. But, and this is key, they didn't ban the pulleys. They didn't say, "Nice try, Dale, go back to the old ones." They realized that you can't uninvent technology. You can't tell engineers to forget what they know. Instead, they updated the rulebook to standardize it. They wrote new specs that defined the allowable tooth profiles, the materials, and the surface finishes. They basically took Armstrong's secret intellectual property and made it the public standard. It was the ultimate compliment. The rulebook that Armstrong had outsmarted was rewritten to include his genius. Today, if you walk into a top fuel pit, you will see the great-grandchildren of those pulleys. The modern engines are making 11,000 horsepower. They are monsters that defy logic. But if you look closely at the blower drive, you will see that familiar, aggressive, industrial tooth profile. It's still there. The DNA of that Louisiana machine shop is spinning on every single car, on every single pass, 30 years later. So why does this story matter to us? Why am I telling you about a piece of aluminum from 1992? Because it breaks the biggest myth in car culture. We tend to think that speed costs money. We think that to go fast, you need the biggest budget, the fanciest shop, and the most expensive parts. And sure, money helps, but Dale Armstrong didn't beat the world with money. He beat them with perspective. He looked at a problem that everyone else had accepted as normal. Everyone else said, belt slip, that's just physics. Armstrong said, no, that's just bad engineering. He refused to accept the status quo. He was willing to look outside of his own industry, to look at conveyor belts in a bottling plant to find the answer for a race car. That is the definition of a sleeper mindset. It's not just about building a car that looks slow and goes fast. It's about thinking differently. It's about looking at the parts bin and seeing potential where others see junk. It's about realizing that the biggest gains often come from the smallest details.
Armstrong passed away in 2014, and he took a lot of secrets with him. But in an interview years after he retired, someone asked him if he was angry that the secret got out, if he was mad that he didn't patent it and become a millionaire. He just laughed. He said that by the time a patent would have been approved, the racers would have stolen it anyway. That's just the nature of the beast. He said the real thrill wasn't the money. It was knowing, for those 6 glorious months in 1992, that he was the smartest guy in the room. It was watching the other crew chiefs scratching their heads, chasing ghosts, while his car was already packed up in the trailer with the trophy sitting on the dashboard. There is a lesson here for your own builds. Whether you are building a turbo LS for the street, or restoring a vintage muscle car, or just trying to get your daily driver to run a little smoother, stop looking at the catalog. Stop just buying the Stage 1 kit because the internet told you to. Look at the mechanical reality of what you're doing. Ask yourself, where is the waste? Where is the slip? What is the one thing everyone else is ignoring? Maybe it's your alignment. Maybe it's your tire pressure. Maybe it's the way your intercooler piping is routed. There is almost always a pulley hiding in your project. Something simple, something cheap that is holding back your true potential. You just have to be willing to look for it. You have to be willing to be the one person in the room who asks, why do we do it this way? Top fuel racing today is a spectacle of brute force. It is violence on a scale that is hard to comprehend. But the next time you see those flames shooting out of the headers, and you feel that shock wave hit your chest, remember that some of that power, a significant chunk of it, isn't coming from the fuel. It's coming from the mind of a mechanic who decided to fix a pulley. And that, to me, is the coolest thing about cars. The machines are only as fast as the minds behind them. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the engineering history of the NHRA, do me a favor. Drop a comment below and tell me, what is the single smartest hack or modification you have ever seen on a car? I want to hear about the zip tie fixes, the junkyard swaps, the things that shouldn't work but do. I read every single comment, and I might feature the best one in the next video. Also, if you want to see more content like this, where we don't just show you the cars, but we explain the why and the how, make sure you are subscribed to Legacy Motoring. We have some incredible stories coming up, including a look at the illegal suspension setup that got a WRC team banned for a year, and the story of the ghost fuel tank that won NASCAR races. You do not want to miss those.
In the high-stakes world of drag racing, there is a saying that has been passed down through pit lanes for decades. If you aren't cheating, you aren't trying. But in the early 1990s, inside the most prestigious factory-backed class of the NHRA, that saying stopped being a joke and became a survival strategy. We aren't talking about a little gray area here. We aren't talking about bending a rule about body panels or fuel additives. We are talking about a conspiracy so deep, so technically sophisticated, and so financially motivated that it didn't just break the rules, it almost broke the sport. This is the story of the Great Gas War, the invisible nitrous oxide scandal that turned American motorsport into a crime scene. This is Legacy Motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the dark corners of automotive history. If you're someone who loves the technical grit of racing and the stories they try to bury, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, to really get why this matters, you have to understand the landscape. Picture the late 1980s. This was the golden era of the factory hot rod. You had the big three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, locked in a marketing war that was costing them millions. The mantra was win on Sunday, sell on Monday, and nowhere was that more true than in pro stock. Unlike top-field dragsters or funny cars which looked like spaceships and ran on nitro-methane, pro stock cars look like the vehicles you could actually buy. A Chevrolet Beretta, a Dodge Daytona, a Ford Probe. They had doors, they had windshields, and under the hood, they had gasoline-burning V8s. But here's the thing. Pro stock is without a doubt the most difficult class in drag racing to find horsepower. It is a naturally aspirated class. That means no superchargers, no turbochargers, and definitely no nitrous oxide. You are limited to 500 cubic inches. You have to use 2 carburetors, the air goes in, the fuel mixes, and the spark ignites it. That's it. It is a playground for pure engineering. When you are restricted like that, finding even 5 extra horsepower is a monumental achievement. Engineers would spend months redesigning a cylinder head just to gain 2 horsepower. It was a game of inches. And then, suddenly, it wasn't. Around 1990, something shifted. A team, specifically the Wayne County Speed Shop team running Dodge Daytonas, started doing things that shouldn't have been physically possible. They weren't just winning, they were gapping the field. They were setting records that left legendary engine builders scratching their heads. Now, you might be thinking, maybe they were just smarter. Maybe they found a better airflow design. And that's a fair thought. In racing, someone is always faster. But this was different. The math didn't add up. You see, an internal combustion engine is basically an air pump. Its potential power is limited by how much air it can suck in. In a naturally aspirated 500 cubic engine, there is a theoretical ceiling. You can't just magically create more atmosphere. Yet these cars were running times that suggested they were making horsepower numbers that defied the laws of physics for that displacement. It started with whispers in the pits. Crew chiefs would stand at the starting line watching the Dodges launch and they'd hear something. Or rather, they wouldn't hear something. A naturally aspirated engine has a specific cadence. It bogs slightly under load. But these cars, they sounded different. They were too crisp. They recovered from gear shifts too quickly. Here's what most people don't realize about professional drag racers. They are like human dynos. A guy like Bob Glidden, who is basically the godfather of pro stock, a blue-collar Ford hero who built his own engines in a barn, could listen to a car go down the track and tell you within 10 horsepower what it was making. And Bob Glidden was looking at the Dodge boys, Darrell Alderman and Scott Jeffreyon, and he knew. He didn't just suspect, he knew in his bones that they were spraying. Spraying, of course, means using nitrous oxide. For the uninitiated, let's break down why this is such a nuclear option. Nitrous oxide, or N2O, isn't fuel, it's an oxidizer. When you heat it up, like inside a combustion chamber, it splits apart and releases massive amounts of oxygen. More oxygen means you can burn more fuel. And because it comes out of the bottle at freezing temperatures, it cools down the intake charge, making the air denser. It is effective, it is cheap, and in pro stock, it is strictly 100% illegal. Using nitrous in a class defined by all motor performance is like bringing a gun to a knife fight. It's not an advantage, it's a cheat code. If you have a button that gives you an extra 50 or 100 horsepower in a class where people kill for 5, you aren't racing anymore. You're robbing the bank. But making the accusation and proving it are two very different things. The NHRA, the National Hot Rod Association, had a tech department, obviously. Every car was inspected. They checked fuel, they checked weight, they checked displacement. So how do you hide a pressurized bottle, high pressure lines, solenoids, and injection nozzles in a car that is being stripped down and inspected by experts every weekend? This is where it gets really interesting. The level of engineering that went into hiding the nitrous was actually more impressive than the engineering of the engines themselves. We aren't talking about a bottle simply thrown in the back seat under a blanket. We are talking about James Bond levels of concealment. Imagine you are an NHRA inspector. You open the hood. You see a standard V8 engine. You see the braided steel fuel lines running to the carburetors. You see the brake master cylinder. You see the battery box. Everything looks stock. Everything looks legal. You have no idea that you are looking right at the cheat. The rumors began to swirl that the Dodge boys were utilizing the chassis itself to store the gas. Some said the roll cages were pressurized. Others whispered that the nitrous lines were running inside the vacuum hoses for the brakes. Bob Glidden was getting furious. He was the king of the hill, the hardest working man in the sport, and he was getting his doors blown off by guys he didn't respect, guys he believed were frauds. Glidden started going to the media. He gave interviews that were less like sports commentary and more like police statements. He was calling them out. He was telling anyone who would listen that the NHRA was letting it happen. And this is a crucial point. Why would the NHRA let it happen? Well, look at the money. Chrysler, or Dodge, was dumping millions into the sport. They were sponsoring the telecasts. They were buying ad space. The Mopar Direct Connection was the biggest marketing campaign in racing. If the NHRA busted the factory-backed team for blatant cheating, it wouldn't just be a scandal, it would be a financial disaster. Dodge might pull out. The fans might revolt. The credibility of the entire series would be shot. So there was a perception, whether true or not, that the sanctioning body was wearing blinders. They didn't want to find anything. But Bob Glidden wasn't going to let it go. He was losing races, losing championships, and losing money. The frustration in the Ford camp was palpable. It wasn't just about losing, it was about the gaslighting. Being told you were too slow when you knew you were running at the jagged edge of perfection is a psychological torture. The tension in the pits by 1994 and 1995 was toxic. Drivers weren't talking to each other. Crew chiefs were guarding their trailers like military installations. You had the haves, the teams that everyone suspected were spraying, and the have-nots, the guys trying to do it legally. And the gap was widening. But the secrets were getting harder to keep. You can only hide a pressurized gas system for so long before physics catches up with you, or before someone gets careless, or before someone gets greedy. The first cracks in the wall of silence didn't come from an inspection. They came from a crime. It was May of 1995 when the silence finally broke. Or rather, it was shattered. The Wayne County Speed Shop in Michigan was the fortress of the Dodge Boys operation. It was where the horsepower was found, where the dyno cells ran late into the night, and where the secrets were kept. But one morning, the team arrived to find a scene that looked less like a burglary and more like a mob hit. Now, usually when a race shop gets broken into, the thieves want the tools. They want the welders, the raw materials, maybe even the transmissions, because they are high-dollar items that are easy to fence. But in this break-in, the thieves left the tools, they left the cars, they left the transmissions. What they did do was systematically destroy 6 pro-stock engines with sledgehammers. Think about that for a second. These are engines worth $50,000 to $80,000 each, and someone didn't steal them. They murdered them. They took hammers to the blocks, the heads, the intakes. It was precise, it was thorough, and to anyone paying attention, it screamed one thing: destruction of evidence.
The official story was a break-in, but the paddock had a different theory. The rumor, and let me be clear, this has been the subject of debate for 30 years, was that the NHRA had finally cornered the Dodge team. The theory goes that the sanctioning body found the nitrous, or at least found enough proof to nail them, but they couldn't afford the scandal of banning their biggest factory team. So a deal was allegedly cut. Destroy the engines, get rid of the evidence, sit out for a while, and we won't ban you for life. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, right? Like something out of a bad movie. But here is the smoking gun. After that break-in, the Dodge boys, who had been absolutely dominating, suddenly couldn't qualify. They disappeared. The team that was setting records was suddenly struggling to make the field. You don't just forget how to build horsepower overnight, unless the horsepower you were building came from a bottle that you were no longer allowed to use. But even with the Dodge boys out of the picture, the genie was out of the bottle. The technology for hiding nitrous had advanced so much that other teams were now tempted to use it. If the factory teams were doing it, why shouldn't the privateers? It became an arms race of deception, and that brings us to the single most explosive moment in pro stock history. Fast forward to 1997, National Trail Raceway, Columbus, Ohio. Jerry Ekman is a solid driver, a veteran. His crew chief, Bill Orndorff, is known for being, let's say, creative. They are in the staging lanes for qualifying. The car is fired up, everything seems normal, and then, boom. A massive explosion rocks the pit area. It wasn't a fuel line. It wasn't a catastrophic engine failure in the traditional sense. A nitrous bottle, which had been hidden inside the car's dry sump oil tank, had exploded. Here is the genius and the madness of that setup. They had hidden the nitrous bottle inside the oil reservoir. The idea was that the oil would conceal the bottle from visual inspection. But there was a fatal flaw in the physics. Racing oil gets hot, extremely hot. As the car sat idling, the hot oil heated the nitrous bottle. As nitrous gets hot, the pressure rises exponentially. Eventually, the pressure exceeded the structural integrity of the bottle and it detonated. There was no hiding it now. The shrapnel was everywhere. The evidence was literally scattered across the asphalt. It was a smoking gun the sport had been waiting for. Jerry Ekman was banned for 2 years. He was fined $50,000, a career-ending amount of money for a privateer in the 90s. He became the face of the scandal, the guy who got caught. But here's where it gets tragic. Ekman maintained for years that he was the fall guy. He claimed he didn't know the extent of it, that he was pressured by the team owner and crew chief. Whether you believe him or not, his career was effectively over. He went from a respected driver to a pariah. Meanwhile, the big factory teams, the ones who arguably started the whole era of cheating, kept their sponsorships and their reputations largely intact. The Ekman explosion forced the NHRA's hand. They couldn't ignore it anymore. The don't ask, don't tell policy on nitrous was dead. They had to start tearing engines down. They had to start using borescopes to look inside intake manifolds. They had to get serious.
And just when you thought the drama had peaked, the ultimate whistleblower stepped forward. And it wasn't who anyone expected. It wasn't a disgruntled mechanic. It wasn't a rival team owner. It was Rusty Glidden. Rusty was the son of Bob Glidden, the very man who had spent years screaming about cheaters. Bob Glidden was the moral compass of pro stock. He was the guy who stood for hard work and honest racing. So when his son Rusty sat down for an interview and admitted, "Yeah, I used nitrous too," it was like the Pope admitting he robbed the bank. Rusty didn't just admit to using it, he detailed how. And this is where we get into the engineering brilliance I mentioned earlier. He explained that on his Ford Probe, they had hidden the nitrous lines inside the structural tubing of the chassis.
The gas traveled through the roll cage. They had drilled tiny, microscopic holes in the intake manifold flange, holes so small you needed a magnifying glass to see them. But the real magic was the activation. It wasn't a simple button on the steering wheel, that's too obvious. The system was wired into a complex series of relays. It would only arm if the car was in high gear, the engine was above 7,000 RPM, and, get this, the brake lights were off. Why? Because inspectors would often check for switches, but they'd never think to check a logic circuit that required the car to be mid-run to activate. Rusty's confession changed the narrative completely. It proved that this wasn't just one or two rogue teams, it was endemic. It was a culture. If the Gliddens, the most honest family in racing, felt they had to cheat just to keep up, then the sport was broken. It was an admission that the playing field wasn't just tilted, it was vertical. Now, you might be thinking, why would he confess? Why destroy his own reputation? Rusty did it because he was sick of the lies. He wanted to force a reset. He essentially fell on his sword to save the sport. He showed the NHRA exactly where to look, exactly how the plumbing worked, and exactly how deep the rot went. This confession validated everything Bob Glidden had been saying, but it also complicated his legacy. Did Bob know? Could he have not known? The father-son dynamic added a Shakespearean layer to the whole mess. The aftermath of the Glidden confession was a purge. The NHRA implemented new tech procedures that were draconian. They started weighing components down to the gram. They introduced fuel checks that could detect even the slightest trace of oxidizers. The Wild West era of pro stock was coming to an end, but the scars remained. But here's the thing about racers. You can change the rules, but you can't change the nature of the competitor. When they took away the nitrous, the teams didn't just say, okay, we'll race fair now. No, they just moved the cheating to a different area of the car.
If they couldn't make illegal horsepower, they would find illegal ways to put the legal horsepower to the ground. And that brings us to the next chapter of the saga. The tires, the transmissions, and the gray areas that defined the 2000s. Because while the nitrous bottles were gone, the desire to win at any cost was stronger than ever. You have to understand the mindset of a pro stock crew chief. When the NHRA cracked down on nitrous, they didn't see it as a command to stop cheating. They saw it as a challenge to get smarter. The gas was gone. The chemical advantage was dead. So the war moved from the intake manifold to the ground, specifically to the black rubber circles that connect 1,400 horsepower to the asphalt. Tires. In drag racing, tires are everything. You can have all the horsepower in the world, but if you spin the tires for 1/10 of a second, you're going home. The rules state you have to use a specific compound, a specific size, and a specific brand, usually Goodyear. Everyone gets the same tire. But do they? Here's the thing. Rubber is porous. It absorbs chemicals. In the late 90s and early 2000s, a new dark art emerged: tire soaking. Teams would take these spec tires and treat them with chemical softeners, stuff that smelled like wintergreen or industrial solvent, to break down the rubber compound. The goal was to make the tire stickier, softer, more compliant. A softer tire bites the track harder on launch. It gives you a 60-foot time that is maybe 3/100th of a second faster. And then pro stock, 3/100ths is an eternity. The NHRA knew this was happening. They started using sniffers, devices that could detect the chemical signatures of tire treatments. They would walk down the staging lanes, sampling the air around the tires. If your tires smelled like a candy shop, you were disqualified. But the teams adapted. They developed odorless soaking agents. They would treat the tires weeks in advance so the chemicals would gas out before the race, leaving only the structural change in the rubber. It became a game of chemistry versus detection, played out in the tire trailers of America. But tires weren't the only mechanical gray area. Let's talk about transmissions. Pro stock cars use manual transmissions, specifically clutchless 5-speeds. The gear ratios are tightly controlled to keep costs down and competition close. You can't just run a custom gear set that gives you a massive advantage. So how do you change your effective gear ratio without changing the gears? You change the tire size. Now, wait a minute.
The rules say the tire has to be a certain circumference, let's say 105 inches. If you show up with a 102-inch tire, you're illegal. But what if you can make a 105-inch tire act like a 102-inch tire during the run? This is where beadlock wheels and tire pressure manipulation came in. By running incredibly low pressures and using beadlock rims to clamp the tire to the wheel, teams could control how much the tire grew at speed. Centrifugal force makes a tire expand as it spins. A tire that grows more effectively changes your final drive ratio as you go down the track. If you could control that growth better than the guy in the other lane, you had a variable transmission that the rulebook didn't account for. It was brilliant. It was subtle, and it was nearly impossible to police because tires are organic, dynamic things. They change shape with heat and speed. How do you legislate physics?
This era of mechanical manipulation culminated in one of the most controversial changes in the history of the sport, the 2016 EFI mandate. For decades, pro stock was defined by carburetors, big, beautiful, complicated Holley dominators sitting on top of sheet metal intake manifolds. Carburetors are analog, they are mechanical. You tune them with a screwdriver and a jet kit. They are also, historically, easier to hide things in. You can modify the Venturi, you can mess with the boosters, you can hide nitrous plates under them, as we saw. But in 2016, the NHRA dropped a nuclear bomb on the class. They mandated electronic fuel injection, EFI. This wasn't just a tech update, this was a culture shift. Suddenly, the black magic of carburetor tuning was replaced by laptops and fuel maps. The cars now had throttle bodies at the front of the engine, fed by air scoops in the bumper, not the hood. The iconic hood scoops, the visual signature of pro stock for 40 years, were gone. The cars looked different, they sounded different. But the real reason for the switch wasn't just modernization, it was policing. With EFI, the NHRA could mandate a spec ECU, engine control unit. They could set a rev limiter. For the first time, the sanctioning body could literally plug into the car and see exactly what the engine was doing on every single run. They could see fuel flow, ignition timing, RPM, everything. It was the end of the hidden nitrous era for good. You can't hide a nitrous spike in a data log that the officials can download. Or so they thought. The 2016 rules also introduced the hard rev limit, 10,500 RPM. This sounds high to you and me, but for a pro stock engine that used to scream to 11,000 or 11,500 RPM, this was a restrictor plate. And it hit one manufacturer harder than the rest, Dodge. The Chrysler Hemi engine design loves RPM. It breathes better at high speed. The GM LS-based engines were torquier. They didn't need to spin as high to make power. When the 10,500 limit was imposed, the Dodge teams felt targeted. Alan Johnson, a Mopar loyalist and champion, fought and tooth and nail to make it work. But the writing was on the wall. The rule change, intended to level the playing field and stop cheating, had inadvertently tilted the balance of power towards Chevrolet. This brings us to a fascinating concept in motorsport ethics. Is it cheating if the rules simply favor your competitor's architecture? The Dodge team certainly felt robbed. They argued that the 10,500 limit was an artificial constraint designed to help the GM teams who were struggling to keep up with the Hemi's high RPM dominance. Whether that conspiracy theory holds water is up for debate, but the result was undeniable. Dodge eventually pulled factory support from pro stock. The field became almost entirely Chevrolet Camaros. The spec class mentality had taken over. To stop the cheating, the NHRA had tightened the box so much that diversity died. And this is the double-edged sword of policing a sport. If you make the rules too loose, people cheat with nitrous and hidden lines. If you make them too tight, everyone ends up driving the same car, and the manufacturers leave because they can't prove their engineering superiority. But humans are creative. Even in the EFI era, even with the data logs, even with the rev limiters, the desire to find an unfair advantage didn't disappear. It just got weird.
We started seeing controversies about seemingly mundane things: hood shapes, wheelie bar lengths, the angle of the rear spoiler. In 2024, we saw a massive controversy involving Erica Enders, the 6-time world champion and the face of modern pro stock. Now, Erica Enders is a polarizing figure. She is undeniably talented, one of the best drivers to ever let out a clutch. But she drives for Elite Motorsports, a team that is known for pushing the envelope. They are the New York Yankees of pro stock, well-funded, dominant, and hated by the underdogs. In 2024, Enders was disqualified for a violation involving beadlock wheels. The NHRA docked her points and fined the team. The infraction? Technically, it was about the liner inside the wheel not meeting a specific safety spec. But the paddock chatter was different. The rumor was that the team had found a way to manipulate the stiffness of the wheel itself to help the car launch harder, a modern, high-tech version of the old tire soaking trick. Team owner Richard Freeman went ballistic. He argued that the rule didn't exist, that it was a safety interpretation, not a performance one. But the penalty stood. It was a reminder that even in the modern, sanitized, computerized era of pro stock, the cat and mouse game is alive and well. But there's a bigger story here, one that goes beyond just engines and tires. It's about the people, the mechanics, the crew chiefs, the drivers who dedicate their lives to this. Why do they do it? Why risk a $50,000 fine and a lifetime ban just to go 1,000th of a second faster? To understand that, you have to understand the pressure cooker of the pits. Now, look, I'm not here to judge the morality of these people. It's easy to sit on the couch and say, oh, they're cheaters, they're bad for the sport. But let's put ourselves in their shoes for a minute. Imagine you are a crew chief. Your job, your mortgage, your kid's college fund, it all depends on that car going down the track faster than the guy in the other lane. You have a team owner who just spent $2 million on a transporter, engines, and sponsorship deals. You have a manufacturer like Chevrolet or Dodge breathing down your neck, demanding results. And you look at the data and you see that the other team is running numbers that physically don't make sense. You know they're doing something. You don't know what, but you know they're bending the rules. So what do? Do you stay clean and lose every weekend? Do you let your driver look like an amateur? Do you let your sponsor walk away because you aren't winning? Or do you start looking for that gray area yourself? This is the trap. The pressure in professional drag racing is suffocating. It turns good people into creative rule breakers. It turns engineers into magicians. And sometimes it turns them into felons, at least in the eyes of the rulebook. The modern era of cheating isn't about hiding nitrous bottles anymore. It's about interpreting the English language. It's about lawyering the rulebook. Take the factory stock showdown class. This is the modern spiritual successor to the old pro stock battles. You have the Copo Camaros, the Drag Pack Challengers, and the Cobra Jet Mustangs. These are factory-built race cars with superchargers. They are insanely fast, 7-second cars right out of the box. And because they use superchargers, the potential for manipulation is massive. In 2024, a scandal erupted that felt like a callback to the 90s. The issue was supercharger pulleys. Now, for the non-mechanics out there, a supercharger is driven by a bell connected to the engine's crankshaft. The speed at which the supercharger spins, and therefore how much boost it makes, is determined by the size of the pulleys. A smaller pulley on the supercharger spins it faster, making more boost. The NHRA mandates specific pulley sizes to keep the cars equal. They measure them with a go-no-go gauge. It's a simple metal ring. If the gauge fits over the pulley, it's legal. If it doesn't, it's too small and therefore illegal. But here's what the Chevrolet teams figured out. They realized that the shape of the pulley teeth could be modified. By machining the grooves slightly deeper or changing the angle of the teeth, they could effectively change the pitch diameter of the pulley, the effective size the belt sees, without changing the physical outer diameter that the NHRA measured. It was brilliant. The gauge fit perfectly. Visually, the pulley looked stock, but under load, the belt sat deeper in the grooves, spinning the blower faster and making maybe 2-3 pounds more boost. In a class decided by thousandths of a second, 3 pounds of boost is like finding a gold mine. This wasn't some rogue mechanic with a file in a garage. This was high-level CNC machining. This was engineering disguised as compliance. And when the NHRA caught on, the reaction was furious. They didn't just disqualify the run, they confiscated the pulleys. They updated the rulebook mid-season. They were embarrassed because, once again, the racers were smarter than the rule makers. But notice the difference. In the 90s, they were hiding nitrous bottles and brake boosters. That was blatant, undeniable fraud. In 2024, they were machining pulley teeth to a different tolerance. It's cleaner, it's more corporate, but the intent is exactly the same, to find an unfair advantage that the other guy doesn't have. This evolution from outlaw cheating to corporate cheating reflects the changing face of motorsport. It's no longer about who has the biggest balls. It's about who has the best lawyers and the best CAD designers.
And this brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. Does the audience actually want a perfectly clean sport? Think about it. We love the stories. We love the drama. We talk about the Dodge Boys Nitrous scandal with a kind of reverence today. We call them legends. We don't spit on their graves, we build models of their cars. We watch YouTube videos about Smokey Yunick, the greatest cheater of all time, and we laugh. We celebrate the ingenuity. There is a part of us, the fans, that admires the hustle. We want to see David beat Goliath, even if David has a rock hidden in his glove. When everyone is following the rules perfectly, the racing can get, well, boring. It becomes a math equation. Car A has 1,400 horsepower. Car B has 1,400 horsepower. Driver A has a .020 reaction time. Driver B has a .020 reaction time. The result is predictable. But throw in a little creativity, a hidden nitrous line, a modified pulley, a soaked tire, and suddenly you have chaos. You have upsets. You have accusations. You have entertainment. The NHRA knows this. They walk a razor-thin line between maintaining integrity and maintaining interest. If they crack down too hard, the manufacturers leave, like Dodge did. If they don't crack down enough, the privateers leave because they can't compete. It is a balancing act that has defined the sport for 50 years. And sometimes the cheating actually drives innovation. Let's go back to the suspension wars of the early 2000s. Teams started experimenting with active suspension. Now, active suspension, where computers control the shocks in real time, is banned in almost every racing series on Earth. It's too expensive and it takes the skill away from the driver. But in pro stock, teams found the mechanical way to do it. They developed shock absorbers with internal valving that would dump or release pressure at a specific moment during the launch. It wasn't electronic, it was fluid dynamics. By controlling the fluid transfer inside the shock, they could make the rear of the car squat and then lock in place, planting the tires harder than a standard shock ever could. Was it illegal? Technically, no. The rulebook said no electronic control. It didn't say no complex hydraulic valving. It was a loophole, a massive, gaping loophole that allowed teams to run 60-foot times that were previously impossible. The NHRA eventually stepped in and regulated shock technology, but the damage, or the progress, depending on how you see it, was done. The knowledge gained from those illegal shocks trickled down to the aftermarket. Today, you can buy drag shocks for your street car that use similar technology. The cheating made the parts better for everyone. So, is it really cheating if it pushes the engineering forward? Or is that just a convenient excuse we use to justify breaking the rules? The reality is that pro stock is a dying breed of racing. The cars are expensive, millions of dollars a year to run a top team. The viewership is aging. The relevance to modern road cars is almost zero. When was the last time you saw a naturally aspirated 500 cubic inch V8 in a showroom? In this environment, the desperation to win is higher than ever because the pie is getting smaller. There are fewer sponsorships to go around, fewer factory dollars. So the fight for the crumbs is vicious. And that is why, even today, in 2026, I guarantee you there is something on a pro stock car that isn't quite legal. Maybe it's a new fuel additive that evaporates before the test sample can be taken. Maybe it's a new way to manipulate the clutch data. Maybe it's something we haven't even thought of yet.
Because as long as there's a rulebook, there will be someone reading it with a magnifying glass, looking for the white space between the lines.
We live in a digital age now, and the cheating has gone digital too. It's no longer about hiding a nitrous bottle in a brake booster or drilling holes in a manifold. It's about code. It's about lines of data buried deep within the firmware of an ECU that vanish the moment the car's turned off. It's about ghost maps, fuel tables that only exist under specific, undetectable conditions. The modern cheater isn't a mechanic with a wrench. He's a software engineer with a laptop. And this terrified the NHRA more than anything else. You can find the physical bottle, you can weigh a piston, you can measure a pulley, but how do you find a line of code that deletes itself? The sanctioning body has had to become a software company just to keep up. They now have dedicated IT specialists whose only job is to hack the race car's computers to ensure they are clean. It's a cyber war fought at 200 miles per hour. But let's step back from the technology for a moment, because at the end of the day, this isn't a story about machines. It's a story about human nature. It's about the lengths we will go to for glory. It's about the absolute, unwavering belief that we deserve to win, even if we have to break the rules to do it. There is a tragedy in that, sure. We want our heroes to be pure. We want to believe that the guy holding the trophy won because he was the best driver, not because he had the best cheat. But there is also something deeply, undeniably human about it. It's the same impulse that drives athletes to use steroids, or students to cheat on exams, or businesses to cook the books. It is the fear of being average. In the world of pro stock, average means you go home broke. It means you fire your crew. It means you sell your trailer. The stakes are life-altering. So when a crew chief is staring at a dyno sheet at 3 a.m. and he knows that a little extra help could save his team, can you really blame him? Can you honestly say you wouldn't do the same if your entire livelihood depended on it? The gas wars of the 90s, the tire soaking of the 2000s, the pulley scandals of today, they are all just chapters in the same book. The technology changes, the rules change, but the desperation remains constant. And honestly, that desperation is what makes the sport so compelling. We watch racing because it is extreme. We watch it because it pushes boundaries. If everyone followed the rules perfectly, if every car was exactly the same, if there was no controversy, no scandal, no he said, she said, would we still care? Probably not. We need the villains. We need the accusations. We need the Bob Glidden screaming at the Dodge Boys. We need the Jerry Ekmans exploding in the staging lanes. It adds a layer of narrative depth that simple lap times can never provide. So, how do we judge the legacy of the pro stock cheaters? Were they criminals destroying the integrity of the sport? Or were they pioneers pushing the envelope of what was possible, forcing the sport to evolve? I think the answer is both. They broke the rules absolutely. They stole wins. They cost honest teams millions of dollars. But they also forced the NHRA to get better. They forced the technology to advance. They created a history that is richer, darker, and more fascinating than a simple list of race winners. They made pro stock legendary. And maybe, just maybe, that is their true contribution. They reminded us that in the pursuit of speed, there are no saints. There are only winners and losers. And history, as they say, is written by the winners, even if they used a little nitrous to get there. The next time you see a pro stock car launch, front wheels in the air, screaming toward the finish line, don't just look at the time on the board. Look deeper. Look at the crew chief nervously pacing the starting line. Look at the official scrambling to check the data. Look at the driver's eyes in the post-race interview. And ask yourself, what are they hiding? Because in this sport, if you aren't hiding something, you probably aren't winning. That razor-thin line between innovation and fraud that we talked about at the beginning, it never disappeared. It just moved. It's still there, waiting for the next genius, the next desperate soul to cross it. And when they do, we'll be right here, ready to tell the story. Because that is what we do at Legacy Motoring. We don't just watch the race, we watch the war. We dig into the dirty, messy, beautiful reality of motorsport. We celebrate the rogues and the rule breakers just as much as the champions. Why?
because without them, it's just traffic. This has been a deep dive into the most controversial era of drag racing history. I hope it gave you a new perspective on what it really takes to win at the highest level. It's not always pretty, and it's definitely not always legal, but it is always exciting. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the pro stock underworld, if you learned something about the dark arts of racing that you didn't know before, do me a huge favor. Smash that subscribe button. It helps us keep the lights on and keep digging for these stories. Leave a comment below. Do you think that Dodge Boys were villains or just smarter than everyone else? I read every single comment and I want to know where you stand. And hey, if you want to see more content like this, maybe a deep dive into the Smokey Yunick stories or the active suspension wars of F1, let me know. There are a million skeletons in the closet of motorsport history, and I intend to find every single one of them. You know, sometimes the smartest engineering solution isn't the one that costs $1 million or requires a team of NASA scientists. Sometimes it's just really stupid. Like, stupid simple. What if I told you that one of the greatest mechanical deceptions in the history of motorsport didn't involve hitting nitrous oxide lines, electronic traction control, or specialized fuel additives? No, it involved a trip to the grocery store. It involves something you probably have sitting in a junk drawer in your kitchen right now. We are talking about paraffin wax. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the dark art of racing engine cheats. If you're someone who loves it when a mechanic outsmarts a billion-dollar rulebook with $5 worth of household supplies, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, to understand why this specific trick is so legendary, you have to understand the era we are dealing with. We need to go back to 1983. This was the Wild West of NASCAR. Today, the cars are basically spec machines. They are scanned with lasers, the parts are handed out by the sanctioning body, and if a screw is turned 3 degrees to the left instead of the right, you get disqualified. But back then, oh man, back then, the rulebook was more like a suggestion box. It was a game of cat and mouse played at 200 miles an hour. And sitting right in the center of this game was the king, Richard Petty, and his brother, the mechanical genius, Maurice Petty. Now, you might be thinking, Richard Petty, the guy with 200 wins? He didn't need to cheat. And sure, the guy could drive, but by the early 80s, the competition was getting fierce. The cars were getting faster, the aerodynamics were getting slicker, and every team was fighting for horsepower scraps. The biggest limitation they faced, the absolute hard ceiling, was engine displacement. The rule was clear as day, 358 cubic inches. That was it. You could not run 359. You definitely couldn't run 370. If you showed up with an engine that measured over 358 cubic inches, they didn't just frown at you, they tossed you out. It was the one rule you supposedly couldn't break because it was the one thing they checked with absolute precision before the race. Here's the thing, the inspection process had a flaw, a massive, glaring flaw that nobody really talked about, but everybody kind of knew existed in the back of their minds. The inspection was done cold. When the NASCAR officials rolled up with their measuring equipment, usually a P&G pump that measured the volume of air displacement in the cylinder, the engine was sitting there, stone cold, quiet. The officials would check it, certify it as legal, seal the hood, and walk away. Once that sticker was on the car, you were good to go. The car was assumed legal for the rest of the weekend. Maurice Petty, being the obsessive engine builder he was, looked at this process and started thinking. He wasn't looking for a way to make a 358 cubic inch engine faster. That's what everyone else was doing. They were porting heads, changing cam profiles, messing with compression ratios. Maurice was thinking differently. He was asking a fundamental question. How can I race a big engine but inspect a small one? It sounds like a riddle, right? How can an object change its physical size between the inspection bay and the racetrack? This is where it gets really interesting. The answer wasn't metal. Metal expands when it gets heat, sure, but not enough to gain you 15 cubic inches of displacement. You need a material that exists in one state when it's cold and completely disappears when it's hot. Sound familiar? It's the same physics that makes a candle burn down, but applying that to a high-performance V8 engine is absolutely insane. Let's pause for a second and talk about the actual scale of the advantage we are discussing here. Most people don't realize how valuable a single cubic inch is in racing. In a naturally aspirated engine of that era, the general rule of thumb was that you could extract roughly 1.7 to 2 horsepower per cubic inch if you were really pushing it. So if you were stuck at 358 cubic inches, you had a theoretical maximum power output. But if you could magically jump to, say, 373 cubic inches, you weren't just gaining a little bit of grunt, you were gaining massive torque. You were talking about an extra 25 to 30 horsepower and, more importantly, a fatter torque curve that lets you pull out of the corners while the other guys are still waiting for their engines to wind up. It's like being in a fist fight where you are allowed to bring a baseball bat and the other guy has to keep his hands in his pockets. So Maurice has this idea. Wax, but not just any wax. He needs something that is hard enough to withstand the pressure of the inspection pump, but soft enough to melt instantly when the engine fires. If he uses something too hard, it might not melt fast enough and could damage the pistons. If he uses something too soft, the inspection pump might displace it and the gig is up before the car even starts. He starts experimenting with paraffin. Now, picture the scene. It's late at night in Level Cross, North Carolina. The shop is quiet. Maurice is there with a block of wax and a Bunsen burner, probably looking like a mad scientist. He realizes that if he melts the wax and pours it into the combustion chamber, specifically into the valve pockets and the area right above where the piston sits at top dead center, he can artificially reduce the volume of the cylinder. Think of it like this. Imagine you have a gallon bucket. You want to prove to someone that it's only a half-gallon bucket. So before they look inside, you fill the bottom half with concrete. They measure the remaining space and boom, it measures half a gallon. But concrete doesn't go away. Maurice needed concrete that would turn into air the moment the green flag dropped. He figured out that by coating the inside of the cylinder head and the top of the cylinder walls with this layer of wax, he could take a 373 cubic inch engine, a monster of a motor, and make it read exactly 358 on the P&G pump. The official pumps air in, the air hits the wax, the gauge reads legal, and the official walks away. But here is where the anxiety must have been paralyzing. You have to understand the risk. This wasn't a slap on the wrist offense. If you got caught with illegal fuel, they fined you. If you got caught with a roofline that was too low, they made you fix it. But tampering with engine displacement, that was the cardinal sin. That was an attack on the very foundation of the sport. If they found wax inside that engine, it wouldn't just be a fine, it would be a humiliation. It would be a stain on the petty name that had taken decades to build. Yet, they decided to do it anyway. Why? Because winning is a drug, and in 1983, the Petties were addicts looking for their next fix. They built the engine. They bored the cylinders out way past the legal limit. They stroked the crank. They built a 373 cubic inch beast that had no business being on a Winston Cup track. And then, painstakingly, Maurice and his most trusted crew members, guys who would take a bullet before they talked, began the process of waxing the engine. They had to heat the wax to a specific temperature so it was pliable but not liquid. They had to press it into the corners of the combustion chamber, smoothing it out so it looked like metal if someone happened to shine a flashlight down the spark plug hole. It was like sculpting. They were sculpting a lie, a beautiful horsepower generating lie. Can you imagine the tension in that shop? One sneeze, one slip of the hand, and the wax cracks or flakes off. And once the engine was assembled, they couldn't start it. That's the kicker. You can't fire up the engine to test it, because if you do, the wax melts and you lose your disguise. They had to build it, wax it, seal it, and pray that it would hold together until the NASCAR official stuck his probe in there. It was a leap of faith taken on the wings of a paraffin candle. And the day of inspection arrives. The car rolls into the tech line at Richmond. The officials are grumpy, it's loud, it's chaotic. They get to the 43 car. The official unscrews a spark plug. He inserts the tube for the P&G pump. Maurice is probably standing there, chewing on a toothpick, looking calm as a cucumber, while his heart is hammering against his ribs like a piston in a red-lined engine. The official pumps the handle. He looks at the gauge. He pumps it again, just to be sure. He pulls the tube out. He looks at Maurice. "You're good," the official grunts, scribbling a signature on the clipboard. "Next." The relief must have been physical. It was the kind of relief that makes your knees weak. They had done it. They had successfully smuggled an illegal engine right under the noses of the strictest inspectors in motorsport. But here's the thing. The hard part wasn't over. In fact, the most dangerous part of the trick was just beginning. See, passing inspection is one thing. Actually running the race without destroying the engine is another. Remember, that wax is taking up space in the combustion chamber. When the engine is cold, that space is solid. But when you fire up a 700 horsepower NASCAR V8, things get violent very, very quickly. You have explosions happening thousands of times a minute. You have heat spiking instantly. The fear wasn't just, will it melt? The fear was, will it melt evenly? If a chunk of wax broke off too early and bounced around the cylinder, it could foul a spark plug. It could get stuck in a valve seat, holding a valve open just a fraction of an inch. If that happened, the piston would come up and smack the valve, and boom, your race is over, and you have a blown engine full of illegal evidence for everyone to see. So the start of the race was a delicate dance. Richard Petty rolls off the grid. The engine is firing and the coolant temperature is rising. 160 degrees, 180 degrees. Inside those cylinders, a transformation is happening that no one in the grandstands can see. The paraffin wax, which had been masquerading as solid metal, begins to weep. It softens, turning from a solid block into a thick, viscous liquid. Now you might be thinking, where does the wax go? It's not like it can just vanish into another dimension. Well, this is where the genius of the plan really shines. It goes out the tailpipe. As the wax melts, it mixes with the burning fuel and air. It gets vaporized. For a few laps, the car might have been running a little rich, maybe puffing a tiny bit of unusual smoke, but in a pack of 40 cars all belching exhaust fumes, nobody noticed. It was the perfect disposal system. The evidence of the crime was literally being burned away by the act of committing the crime. By lap 10 or 15, the transformation was complete. The wax was gone. The combustion chambers were now clean, naked metal. And suddenly, the physics of the engine changed. The effective volume of the cylinder increased. The engine went from a choked-down 358 cubic inches to a full-throated, deep-breathing 373. It was like a switch had been flipped. Imagine being Richard Petty in that car. You're driving along, managing traffic, and then suddenly the pedal feels different. You put your foot down coming off turn 2, and the car doesn't just accelerate, it surges. It has more grunt. It has more torque. You're hitting your red limiter sooner on the straights because the engine is pulling so much harder. It must have felt like a superpower. While every other driver on the track was fighting with a standard legal engine, Petty was piloting a monster that was getting stronger with every lap. The numbers back this up. We're talking about a significant advantage here. In a sport where qualifying times are measured in thousandths of a second, a 30 horsepower advantage is absolutely astronomical. It allowed Petty to run different lines. He could drive deeper into the corner, get the car rotated, and then use that massive torque advantage to drag race everyone down the straightaway. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a slaughter. And sure enough, on February 20th, 1983, at the Richmond Fairgrounds Raceway, the number 43 car was a rocket ship. Petty dominated. He didn't just win, he commanded the race. He led massive chunks of laps, and when the checkered flag waved, the king rolled into victory lane to celebrate his 198th career win. The crowd went wild. The team celebrated. Maurice Petty probably let out a breath he had been holding for 3 days. But this is where it gets really interesting. And it's a lesson in how criminals, whether they are bank robbers or race car mechanics, usually get caught. It's rarely the big crime that brings them down. It's the sloppy little mistake they make on the side. See, the engine worked perfectly. The wax trick was a complete success. If they had just packed up the car and gone home, we might never have known about it. But the team had gotten greedy. They weren't just cheating with the engine, they were pushing the envelope everywhere. A sharp-eyed NASCAR official named Dick Beatty was walking around the car in Victory Lane. Now, Victory Lane is usually a chaotic party, but Beatty was working. He was looking at the car and something caught his eye. The tires, specifically the left side tires. In NASCAR, you have left side tires and right side tires. The tracks are ovals, so the load is different on each side of the car. The right side tires take a beating, so they are harder and tougher. The left side tires are softer to provide grip. But here's the thing. The Petty team had mounted left-side tires on the right side of the car. Or rather, they were using a softer compound tire where they shouldn't have been. Why? Because softer tires equal more grip. More grip equals faster corner speeds. Beatty noticed that the tire codes didn't match what should have been there. It was a visible external infraction. He frowned. He called over his team. "Check those tires," he said. And just like that, the dominoes started to fall.
Because the tires were illegal, NASCAR decided they weren't just going to give the car a cursory glance. They were annoyed. They felt disrespected. So they ordered a full tear-down inspection. They told the Petty crew, "Bring the car to the tech shed. We're taking it apart." This is the nightmare scenario. This is the moment your stomach drops through the floor. Maurice Petty knew that the wax was gone. He knew the evidence had been blown out the tailpipe. But he also knew something else, something most people don't realize about engines. An engine tells a story. Even if the wax is gone, the metal remembers. When NASCAR puts an engine through a full teardown, they don't just look at it. They measure everything. They pull the cylinder heads off. They take up the pistons. They measure the bore diameter. They measure the stroke length. And then they do the math. Bore times stroke times number of cylinders equals displacement. The officials started measuring. They checked the bore. It was big. Really big. They checked the stroke. It was long. They punched the numbers into their calculators. I can only imagine the silence in that tech shed. The calculator didn't say 358. It didn't say 359. It said 373. The official probably looked at the calculator, shook it, and did the math again. 373 cubic inches. It was undeniable. The engine was massive. It was a blunderbuss in a room full of sniper rifles. They turned to Maurice. "Maurice," the official said, "this engine is illegal. It's huge." Now, this is the moment where most people would fold. They would admit it. They would say, "Okay, you got me." But Maurice Petty, he played it cool. He played dumb. He looked at the engine and said, "I don't know how that happened. Maybe the carbon buildup is throwing off your measurements. Maybe the engine expanded because of the heat." He was grasping at straws, but he was doing it with a straight face. But the officials weren't buying it, and as they looked closer at the cylinder heads, they saw something odd. In the nooks and crannies of the intake ports, in the tiny crevices where the air and fuel mix, there was a residue, a faint waxy film. The wax hadn't burned off completely. There were microscopic traces left behind, like a fingerprint left at a crime scene. The officials scraped a little bit of it off. They rubbed it between their fingers. It was waxy. It was paraffin. And suddenly, the whole picture clicked into place. They realized what Maurice had done. They realized the audacity of it. They realized that they had been duped, not just today, but probably for months. The fine was historic. $35,000. In 1983, you could buy a pretty nice house for $35,000. It was the largest fine in NASCAR history at the time. They stripped the team of points, 104 championship points. It was a hammer blow. But here is where the story takes a weird turn. They didn't take away the win. Richard Petty kept the victory. Why? Well, that's a complicated question involving politics, the popularity of the king, and the weird way NASCAR rules were written back then. But the message was sent loud and clear. The wax era was over. However, the legacy of that engine didn't die in the tech shed. In fact, getting caught only made the legend grow. It forced us to ask a difficult question. Was this cheating or was this engineering? Look, if you ask a lawyer, it's cheating. It broke the written rules. But if you ask a racer, if you ask the guys who stay up until 4 a.m. welding exhaust headers and grinding camshafts, they look at the wax trick with reverence because it required imagination. It required looking at a problem, a hard displacement limit, and finding a solution that existed outside the box of traditional mechanics. So the wax trick was dead. NASCAR made sure of that. Immediately following the Richmond scandal, the rulebook changed overnight.
The officials stopped relying on those polite, cold engine checks. They started implementing random post-race teardowns and, crucially, hot displacement checks. They would drag a car right off the track while the headers were still ticking from the heat and pump the cylinders. If you had wax in there, it would be liquid, it wouldn't displace volume, and you'd get caught immediately. The loophole was welded shut. But here's what most people don't realize about this story. We tend to focus on the wax part because it's funny, it's household, it's low-tech, it's clever. But the real engineering genius wasn't just in making the engine bigger, it was in making the engine run correctly as it grew. Think about it. An engine is a finely tuned air pump. Every component is selected to work in harmony with specific air volume. The carburetor jets, the ignition timing curve, the exhaust header diameter, and most importantly, the camshaft profile. All of these are chosen based on the engine's displacement. A camshaft designed for a 358 cubic inch engine is going to be different from one designed for a 373. If you just magically added 15 cubic inches to an engine without changing anything else, it wouldn't necessarily be faster. It might actually run like a dog. It would lean out because there's more air but the same amount of fuel. The power band would shift. It might detonate and blow itself to pieces. So Maurice Petit didn't just have to invent a way to hide the displacement, he had to build a transformer engine. He had to build a motor that could survive inspection as a 358, start the race as a 358, and then transition into a high-performance 373 without the driver having to stop and retune the carburetor. That is a logistical nightmare. They had to develop a hybrid tune. They likely jetted the carburetor slightly rich for the 358 setup. When the engine was cold and the wax was solid, it probably ran a little fat, maybe stumbled a bit at idle, maybe smelled like unburnt fuel. But once that wax melted and the displacement grew, the air-fuel ratio would lean out perfectly into the sweet spot. It was a time-delayed fuse. They were tuning the engine not for what it was, but for what it would become 20 laps into the race. And let's talk about the camshaft. The cam is the brain of the engine. It tells the valves when to open and close. Maurice had to grind a custom cam profile that was a compromise. It had to be mild enough to pass the visual checks and idle decently at 358 inches, but aggressive enough to take advantage of the extra airflow once the engine grew. It's like trying to tailor a suit for a guy who is going to gain 40 pounds of muscle in the middle of a dinner party. It's nearly impossible to make it look good in both stages, yet they did it. Now, you might be thinking, was it really worth all that effort? The wax, the custom cams, the stress, the $35,000 fine? Let's run the numbers. That $35,000 fine in 1983 is roughly equivalent to $110,000 or $120,000 today. That sounds like a lot of money. But in professional racing, you have to look at return on investment, just like any other business. If that wax engine trick worked for 10 races before they got caught, and many insiders believe it was running for quite a while, think about the prize money. Think about the sponsorship bonuses from STP. Think about the merchandise sales from winning races. If that engine helped Richard Petty win just 2 or 3 races he wouldn't have otherwise won, that $35,000 fine is pennies. It's a business expense. It's the cost of doing business in the winner's circle. In fact, some team owners in the garage were probably looking at the petty fine and doing the math themselves, thinking, hey, for 30 grand, I'd buy a win right now. This brings us to a darker, more fascinating aspect of the story, the paranoia. Once the wax story broke, it didn't just affect the petty team, it poisoned the garage. Every crew chief started looking at every other crew chief with suspicion. If the king, the squeaky clean face of NASCAR, was stuffing wax in his cylinders, what in the world was everyone else doing? Smokey Yunick, the godfather of creative cheating, famously laughed about the incident. He called it brilliant. Smokey was the guy who once put a basketball in his fuel tank to displace volume during inspection, then inflated it to push the air out and hold more gas. He respected the hustle. But for the officials, it was a wake-up call. They realized they were fighting a war against people who were smarter, better funded, and more desperate than they were. This incident ushered in the modern era of NASCAR technical inspection. Before the wax, inspection was a casual affair among friends. After the wax, it became a forensic investigation. Today, if you walk into a NASCAR garage, you see laser scanning stations. You see templates that are machined to tolerances of thousandths of an inch. You see seals that, if broken, result in immediate suspension. That entire infrastructure of surveillance exists in large part because of Maurice Petty. He forced the sport to grow up. He forced NASCAR to stop being a good old boys club and start being a professional sanctioning body with rigorous standards. But there is something sad about that too. When we standardized everything to stop the cheaters, we also killed the creativity.
Here's what you have to understand about the mindset of a mechanic in the 80s. They didn't see the rulebook as a set of laws. They saw it as a puzzle. The rulebook says maximum displacement 358 cubic inches. It doesn't say maximum displacement 358 cubic inches at all times and at all temperatures. It didn't specify when it had to be 358. Maurice found the white space between the lines of text. Modern engineers don't get to do that. They are given a box and they have to stay inside it. If they try to think outside the box, they get penalized. But Maurice Petty took a sledgehammer to the box. And we haven't even touched on the human element of this deception. Imagine the crew members, the guys who weren't Maurice or Richard, the guys who had to physically pack the wax into the heads. They are the unsung heroes or villains of this story. They had to keep that secret. In a racing paddock, rumors spread faster than fire. Crews drink together, they travel together, they stay in the same hotels. Keeping a secret like, we are using wax to fake our engine size, requires a level of discipline that is almost military. If one guy gets drunk at a bar and brags to a buddy from the Junior Johnson team, it's over. The fact that they kept it quiet for as long as they did is almost as impressive as the engineering itself. It makes you wonder, what else did they get away with? If they were willing to try something as audacious as the wax trick, what other secrets are buried in the landfills of Level Cross, North Carolina? Were there special fuels? Were there acid-dipped chassis that were chemically thinned to save weight? We know for a fact that teams back then were using nitrous oxide hidden in the frame rails. They would pressurize the chassis tubing itself with nitrous and plumb it into the intake. When the race was over, they'd vent the remaining gas and the tank was just the car's frame. Who is to say the Pettys weren't doing that too? The wax was just the one that got caught. It was the tip of the iceberg. This leaves us to a controversial idea. Is cheating actually good for racing? Now, hear me out. I know that sounds wrong. We are taught that fair play is everything. But look at the innovation cycle. The racers cheat, the cars get faster, the officials catch them, and the safety and inspection tech gets better. The cycle repeats. It drives technology forward. Without guys like Maurice Petty pushing the boundaries, NASCAR might have stagnated. By forcing the officials to look closer, by forcing them to understand thermodynamics and metallurgy to catch the cheats, he raised the collective IQ of the entire sport. The wax cylinder trick wasn't just a scam. It was a masterclass in lateral thinking. It's the kind of problem solving they teach in engineering schools today. Here's a constraint, here's your goal, connect them. Maurice didn't use a computer, he didn't use CAD software, he used his brain and a block of paraffin. And let's be honest, there's a reason we are still talking about this 40 years later. We don't talk about the guy who followed the rules and finished fifth. We don't tell stories about the team that ran a legal 358 engine and had a nice clean race. We talk about the pirates. We talk about the outlaws. We love stories about the outlaws. There is something deeply American about the guy who refuses to be told what to do by a piece of paper. But here's the irony that makes this story a tragedy as much as a comedy. The Petty team didn't get caught because the wax failed. The wax worked. The engineering was flawless. They got caught because they got greedy. Think about Al Capone, the most notorious gangster in history. He didn't go to jail for murder or bootlegging or racketeering. He went to jail for tax evasion, a paperwork error.
The Petty wax engine is the exact same story. They pulled off the heist of the century. They stole 15 cubic inches of displacement right under everyone's noses, and then they got pulled over for a broken taillight. That broken taillight was the tire swap. Now you might be thinking, why on earth would they risk a masterful engine cheat just to swap some tires? It seems stupid, right? If you have a super engine, why do you need illegal tires? Here's the thing. Racing teams are incapable of stopping. It's a sickness. If an engineer finds an advantage in the engine, he doesn't say, okay, we're good, let's relax on the chassis. No, he says, great, the engine is illegal, now how can I make the tires illegal too? It's a compounding addiction to speed. The tire scam was simple but dangerous. They took the left side tires, which are coated for the inside of the track and are chemically softer to provide more grip, and they mounted them on the right side. The right side of the car takes the brunt of the load in the corners. It supports the car's weight as it leans. If you put a softer tire there, it won't last as long, but for a short qualified run or a final sprint to the finish, it will grip like glue. It lets you carry maybe 2 or 3 miles per hour more through the center of the corner. It was a nice-to-have advantage. The wax engine was a must-have advantage. They risked the must-have for the nice-to-have. And that is the lesson here. When you are operating in the gray area, you have to be disciplined. You have to pick your battles. The Petty team tried to fight every battle at once, and they stretched their luck until it snapped. But this brings up a massive question that has been debated in bars and garages for 40 years. Did Richard Petty know? This is the elephant in the room. Richard Petty is the king. He is the smile, the sunglasses, the cowboy hat. He is the ambassador of the sport. His public stance has always been, I just drive the car. Maurice builds them, I drive them, I don't ask questions. It's the perfect defense, plausible deniability. But look, I spend way too much time looking at telemetry data, and I'm telling you, a driver knows. Imagine you drive the same Honda Civic to work every single day for 10 years. You know exactly how much you have to press the gas to merge onto the highway. Now imagine one morning you get in, and the car suddenly has 30 extra horsepower. It pushes you back in the seat. The engine note is deeper. The throttle response is sharper. Are you going to notice? Of course you are. Now take that and multiply it by the sensitivity of a professional race car driver. These guys can feel a half pound of air pressure difference in a tire. They can feel a slight wind direction change. The idea that Richard Petty, the greatest driver of his generation, got into a car that was down on power in practice and then suddenly had a rocket ship in the race and didn't think, that's weird. It's almost impossible to believe. He knew the car was fast. He might not have known specifically that it was wax. He might not have known the exact mechanism, but he knew Maurice had done something, and he drove the wheels off it. In a way that makes him complicit, but it also makes him a racer. His job is to trust his crew chief. If the crew chief says go, you go. You don't ask for a spec sheet. There is a famous quote from another racing legend, Darrell Waltrip, who once said, "If you don't cheat, you look like an idiot. If you do cheat and don't get caught, you look like a hero. If you cheat and get caught, you look like a dope. Put me where I look like a hero." That was the ethos of the 1980s. It wasn't about morality, it was about optics. The only sin was getting caught. And because the Pettys got caught so publicly, the wax engine became a symbol of getting caught. It overshadowed the brilliance of the idea itself. But let's zoom out for a second. This story isn't just about NASCAR. It's about the universal struggle between the rule makers and the rule breakers. You see this in every form of motorsport. Formula One? In the 90s, Toyota got banned from the World Rally Championship for a restrictor plate cheat that was arguably even more brilliant than the wax trick. They built a turbo restrictor that physically moved when the inspection tools were applied, sealing the engine to make it legal. But when the car was driving, the restrictor slid open, allowing more air in. The FIA president at the time, Max Mosley, actually called it the most ingenious thing I have seen in 30 years of motorsport. He banned them, but he admired them. That's the exact same energy as the wax engine. It's the engineer saying, we are smarter than the police. It's a hacker mindset. It's the same mindset that leads to breakthroughs in aerospace, in computing, and medicine. It's the refusal to accept no as an answer. However, there is a cost to this. When the wax hit the fan, it marked the end of the gentleman's agreement in NASCAR. Before this, there was a sense that the teams policed themselves. After this, the sport became a police state. The officials had to become more draconian. They started seizing parts. They started handing out lifetime bans. The fun was sucked out of the room because the trust was gone. Maurice Petty's wax trick was the party that got so wild, the cops showed up and shut down the entire neighborhood. And you have to feel for Maurice in that moment. He was a proud man. He was an engine builder who wanted to be known for making the most horsepower, not for being a magician with candles. But history has a funny way of rewriting itself. Today, nobody looks at Maurice Petty as a villain. We look at him as a folk hero. Why? Because the world has changed. We live in an era where cars are computers. If you want to make a modern car faster, you plug in a laptop and change a line of code. It's digital, it's invisible, it's boring. There is no romance in hacking software. But the wax engine? That was analog. That was physical. It involved heat and state changes and fluids and timing. It was visceral. It feels like magic because it relied on the elemental laws of physics rather than binary code. When we look back at the wax engine, we aren't celebrating the cheating. We are celebrating the ingenuity. We are celebrating the fact that a human brain looked at a cold, hard rule and found a soft, pliable loophole. We are also mourning the loss of the garage inventor. Today, you can't be a Maurice Petty. You can't just experiment in your shed and show up to Daytona and beat the factory teams. The barrier to entry is millions of dollars of simulation software. The wax trick was the last gasp of the little guy, even if the little guy was the king, using his wits to beat the system. This brings us to the final and perhaps most surprising insight. The wax trick didn't actually stop in 1983. Sure, nobody used wax again. That specific trick was burned. But the philosophy of the wax trick, the idea of mutable parts, lives on. Engineers today are still trying to do exactly what Maurice did. They are trying to make parts that change shape. We see flexible aerodynamics in Formula One, where wings bend at high speed to reduce drag, but snap back to rigid shapes for inspection. That is just the aerodynamic version of the wax engine. We see active suspension systems that try to hide their movements from sensors. It's the same game. The materials have changed. It's carbon fiber now, not paraffin. But the goal is the same. Pass inspection as one thing, race as another. Maurice Petty didn't invent cheating, but he elevated it to an art form. He made it beautiful. And that is why, 40 years later, we are still staring at that engine block, scratching our heads, and wondering, how the hell did he think of that? So, in the final analysis, was this a stupid trick? Maybe. It was incredibly risky, it was crude, it was messy. But in a world dominated by high-tech sensors and corporate oversight, there is something romantic about beating the system with a candle. It reminds us that racing isn't just about machines. It is about the people. It is about the obsessives and schemers who look at a rulebook and see a challenge rather than a limit. Maurice Petty passed away in 2020, taking his wax formula secrets to the grave. We will never know exactly what blend he used or how many races he stole. But that mystery is part of the appeal. It leaves the door open for us to wonder. It makes us look at our cars differently, wondering what secrets hide in the brackets. It forces us to ask if we have become much too reliant on computers, instead of using the raw, unfiltered creativity that built this sport in the first place. If you enjoyed this deep dive into NASCAR's most creative cheat and want more stories of mechanical ingenuity, make sure you subscribe to Legacy Motoring. We have more secrets to uncover. Drop a comment below. Was Maurice a cheater or a genius? I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and remember, if you aren't bending the rules, you aren't trying hard enough. See you in the next one.